This story begins on a battlefield full of shattered bodies, stretching before a knight on his knees, wounded and exhausted, completing that sanguinary scene only comparable to hell. And in front of him stood his friend Kiri, who had used his body to protect him from the arrows. He thanks him, calling him His Majesty Berun, and apologizes, saying that was all he could do, hoping to have managed to settle his debt. Berun desperately shouted at him to hold on, but it was too late. Kiriego Nisante fell upon his body, and as a final act handed him his sword, asking him to take it, and not stop, and so he died. Berun, gripping the sword hilt next to his friend's corpse, shouted in pain and fury. And then we are told the story of Cairns, the nation created by dragons and humans. This nation coveted the greatest treasure of Secritia, Verum's homeland, and the treasure was the axis of time. But their nation decided to reject their proposal, unleashing this brutal battle in which enemy troops kept arriving, where a lonely but anger-consumed Verum launched the attack, destroying his enemies with no intention of stopping. However, a magic bolt severed his arm, and seeing it as the beginning of his end, he refused to surrender. He didn't even allow his sword to touch the ground, decisively taking it with his only arm. He continued fighting with fierceness and honor, as Verun Secritia, the king of his people and the last man standing. But he was surrounded by enemy mages, increasingly convinced of their victory, incinerating the battlefield. And although Verun felt his end approaching, surrounded by circles of fire, the words of his fallen friend resonated in his mind. Deciding to keep fighting, shaking the flames off himself, and defended himself with Secritia's sword. However, before him rose the army of mages from Caris, the Valkans, and behind them, the man who started the war, the Mad King. Plains and Verun ground his teeth in fury upon beholding those responsible for turning his homeland into hell. And determined, he ran to the front, where the refined and honorable mage commander of the Valkans, Arsene, who asked his name, but Verun had no intention of answering, as he was no longer a man. Now he was only the sword in service to his kingdom, and with his last breath, he lunged against his enemy. Ars, impressed by his bravery, riddled him with his ice technique, promising he would remember the valor of the king of Secritia. And as his body was pierced, he saw his enemies fade from his sight. Then there his life flashed before his eyes. From the first time he smiled, until the moment his homeland was devastated before sinking into the absolute darkness that would end everything. But a new dawn arrived, and elsewhere, a prince is woken up by his cheerful assistants who try to hurry him to go with Prince Planzi. Upon hearing that name, the prince becomes agitated, shouting that his arm has been cut off, confusing his servants, who think he had a nightmare. However, at that moment, a sharp pain pierced his head, flooding him with memories of that man he hated, of that brutal combat and memories that did not belong to him, worrying his assistants further. And his butler reminded him who he was. He was now Kylan Rhine Kairos, the third prince of Kairos, something the protagonist could only qualify as a nightmare. His hands trembled upon hearing those words, as the memories flooded his mind. Confused, he shouted, asking for the date. His servants answered that it was April 28th. Then he asked the year, and the answer was 522. The protagonist became concerned upon realizing he had returned a decade before it broke out. The last great infernal war. This was because of the axis of time, an object capable of turning back time that had appeared in a palace out of nowhere. With rumors spreading across the world, they reached Kairos, which coveted the object. However, firmly, the high command of Secritia rejected the proposal from the enemy nation, thus beginning a war that Kairos seemed to have longed for a long time. And with all his soldiers falling little by little, Verun made the decision to join the fight, despite the pleas of Chase and Human, who asked him not to, as she did not want to lose him too. However, Verun set off towards his fateful destiny, understanding that Chase had surely witnessed his death, crying over his body and wishing to go back before everything happened. And so the protagonist understands, throwing the covers off, jumping out of bed, seeing how Chase gave him a second chance, observing the kingdom, and understanding that this will be the only way to save his homeland. And his butler, still worried, asks him that even though he knows he doesn't like it, he must prepare for the family breakfast. But the protagonist accepts it with a big smile, understanding that to save Secritia, he must adopt this personality and name called Callion. And a short break because I want to tell you about this video's sponsor, which is Mossbit. This is an online platform where you can have a lot of fun where you find an infinity of games, like these, and also online games and many other things. On it, you will receive a first deposit bonus. You just need to enter your country and use the code TERSI, and you will get a 150% bonus and 200 free spins as a gift. And it is totally secure. As it has official licenses, it has totally fast deposits and withdrawals. And clean. It goes without saying that this is only for people over 18, and if you play responsibly. We thank Mospith again. And let's continue with this gem. Just after, he went down for breakfast, being announced by the servants. His assistant suggested he apologize for being late upon entering. There he met the first prince, Randall Sankaris, one of his two half-brothers, who belonged to the sacred lineage of the state of Tenzil, and according to the king's orders, which indicated that breakfast should be prepared for the three princes. Icalian apologizes for his tardiness, only to realize that just like in his inherited memories, everyone ignored him, treating him as if he didn't exist, making him feel like trash, although his concern is that the cause of all his suffering is not yet present. And before his butler could announce him, someone suddenly entered. He was completely disheveled, but his natural attractiveness still stood out, leaving the protagonist astonished by his enormous shamelessness and lack of etiquette, worse being a member of royalty. Seriously doubting, was this the mad king he had heard about, viewing him with some pity? He thought perhaps he was mad in a very different sense than he had imagined. And then he averted his gaze towards Randall, who, despite being older, could not challenge the second prince, as the current queen was Place's biological mother, and no one would be foolish enough to challenge that authority. And so he tries to sip some tea only for Place to recklessly call him out and belittle him just like his mother. Callian trembled with frustration and strove not to spoil this second chance Chase had given him. However, remembering everything the Mad King had caused, a knot formed in his throat, unleashing his murderous glare, which revealed his desire to slit his throat. A look Blaze immediately noticed, and a shattered cup on the floor surprised the servants, courtesy of Blaze, who called Callian out for his look, about to start a fight, until Randolph, without looking them in the eye, asked them to stop. Blaze, astonished by this and seeing Callian's grim stare, left the dining room furiously, hating the protagonist's disgusting blood-colored eyes, who was also surprised by his brother's intervention, who asked him to watch his behavior, especially with the king's birthday so close. And so, annoyed, Callian watched as they blamed him, even though the idiot who smashed the table and had left was Place. Then his butler approached and asked if he wasn't hurt, showing concern for him, even cleaning his shoe. This gesture pleased Callian, as he had a loyal servant looking after him. His name was Jan, whom he thanked with a big smile, surprising the butler, as until that day Callian had only cried in silence. And so we go back to the kingdom's past, remembering the first queen of Karis, the dragon Cephanian. Her hair was as dark as the night sky, and her eyes like sacred flames. And after many years, Callian inherited those traits, but not her powers. Since he was little, he persistently tried to hide his characteristic eyes, terrified by the hatred and the disgust that Prince Blaze held for him. These memories made Callian uncomfortable, as he felt like an intruder experiencing someone else's memories. However, unlike his other self, he did not share that erratic attitude, remembering that Callian was born from a concubine of peasant roots, which made him so weak that he couldn't even protect himself. But none of that was a problem. What is a problem is that before the coming-of-age ceremonies, he will be murdered. And so he asks Jan his age, who replies that he is 15 years old, realizing that not much time is left until that event in which he supposedly tries to poison Queen Silica and fails, dying by his own hand, full of fear of being punished. Or at least that was the official version. However, he, like many others, never believed that version, knowing that they would soon eliminate him, knowing he cannot lose. More time, despite the servants' complaints, he didn't plan to stop, asking Jan for scissors, making a decision, since if the future was predetermined, he would twist everything he could, cutting his hair, revealing those eyes that Place hated so much, and his servants watched him worriedly. But this version of Callian, full of self-confidence, assured that he would fix everything. And so he arrived at the next breakfast, where Place was clearly angry, while Callian was very smiley. And Jan was distressed, trying to understand exactly what the protagonist intended to fix. And not understanding what he will do, Ben, as Plays, sits down pretending to be unconcerned, calling the protagonist Eyes, who corrects him, demanding he call him by his name. The madman agrees to do so, until suddenly he grabs a knife from the table and throws it directly at the protagonist, but he managed to stop it with his hand, to Jan's worry, who saw large drops of blood falling from the wound. Blaze mockingly pretended the knife had slipped from his hands. However, Kalyan got up with absolute calm and left the bloody knife in front of him, giving him a big smile before leaving, and back in his room, Jan treated the wound, insisting they should call a healer, but Kalyan refused, being more worried and uncomfortable about the fact that his butler dodged the attack, so he had to intervene by blocking it. And in reality, the knife was not aimed at him, but at Jan, who, although perfectly capable of dodging it, did not do so to avoid further enraging Blaze. Kalyan agreed with him, but still pretending to be agitated. He went to the bathroom and ordered Jan to stay there, and not to call any healer. He, however, stayed behind crying, worried about his master, and from a distance Kalyan watched him in silence, making sure he followed his orders, and meanwhile, he recalled the moment he stopped the attack. At that moment, he was about to use his aura, but an intense pain in his chest stopped him, doubting his condition, deciding to recreate the situation to evaluate the conditions of his new body. Unleashing his aura throughout the room, and to his surprise, he felt not one, but 3 mana circles surrounding his heart in his chest. At that instant, he realized the truth: the real Kalyan was a mage. And then 3 days passed. Returning to Jan, terrified to see that his lord's wounds were still not healing. However, Kalyan kept assuring he was fine, and it was at that moment that a funny-looking old man burst into the room. It was the royal tailor, Zetin, ready to perform a makeover, and Jan tried to convince him of something before he finished his explanation, which made Kalyan realize that everyone had behaved so strangely since he cut his hair. And he remembered how the original Kalyan had spent his life hating the mother he never knew, and his appearance repudiated by his siblings, and he thus decided that to avoid further problems, he would accept the clothes they wanted to make for him, allowing them to take his measurements. And it was then that they concluded that Kalyan was malnourished, and although he insisted he had eaten well, his body reflected the opposite. Since looking in the mirror, he noticed how the clothes fit him too loosely, and considering that the Kairos family descends from dragons of the 8 heroes who sealed the evil god Achara, and Cispanian, this last one giving the direct line to the royalty of Kairos, which possessed the power of healing and magic, granting their blessing to their descendants. However, his wound remains the same. Realizing that he had not inherited that ability, moreover, when trying to use his aura, he felt intense pressure in his chest, which led him to doubt whether he could use aura or magic at all. Realizing that if things continue like this, he will surely go to the other world when the mercenary arrives, so he must find someone who knows about mana, just as his tailor reminds him that he will have everything ready for the king's birthday. This prompts the protagonist to react, as he knows that the great mage, Elon Manasol, will attend the party, one of the few mages in the 7th kingdom and idol of all mages, who upon his arrival said, "Happy birthday," ending up rejected at the door, unable to participate in the festivities, and so he left ashamed, and his story reached different kingdoms. Some time later, he himself would be news again for having reached the 8th circle, being the only mage on the continent to achieve it, and the man with the greatest knowledge of mana. However, Kalyan doesn't know how to talk to him, because he doesn't even know what incident was it, for which he was rejected in his first life. To this is added that there are hundreds of guards and warriors moving through the city streets, thanks to the influence of the Berun family, led by Blaze's mother, and considering that to keep him in check, it would be good to have the mages as allies, especially Aelin. He believes this could stop the war the Mad King will unleash. But before all that, he focuses his attention on the tailor, his butler, and a happy maiden, who are tailoring him an excessively bright and jewel-encrusted outfit. And he had to take charge of removing all the ribbons, decorations, bells, and any other accessory he considered excessive, despite the complaints of his subordinates. And so time passed, with Kalyan enjoying his tea in bed, getting used to the comforts, seeing his hand recovered, and that place has ignored him since the incident, which is very good for him. Meanwhile, Jan gives him his schedule, which consists of etiquette classes and a dinner with the queen, and the Viscount of Berun. This took Kalyan by surprise. However, Jan suggested it was just something related to his father's birthday, and despite the anxiety the matter caused him, Kalyan knew he had no other choice, so he moved on to the next task of the day, and his servants helped him change for his resistance training, which worried Jan for his safety. The protagonist, however, knew that although they called it training, the only thing he would do was run around the lake. So with a confident smile, he tried to calm his butler's worry, but he didn't count on a simple training of a few meters, almost sending him to meet St. Peter. But utilizing his maiden, Marilyn Fiat, the second daughter of the outer defender commander, to whom it seemed strange that although on the first day, he had managed to go around the lake 4 times, on the second and third, he barely managed to complete 3.5, and now with difficulty, he had completed 3, clearly showing a pattern. The more he trained, the more his resistance decreased, so Marilyn suggested he call his healer. Callian, worried, flatly refused, fearing the healer might discover the magic circles on his body, and thus reveal his identity as a mage, hastening his execution. To avoid being reckless, he feigned indifference to his maiden's insistence, although inside he knew he wasn't well at all. Luckily, at that moment they heard shouts nearby. It was the soldiers beginning their training. Their instructor was giving orders in a firm voice, and Callian observed them with a smile, remembering old times. However, Marilyn became even more worried, as she recognized the group of soldiers as the Pavel Knights. Callian admitted they seemed interesting to him, which agitated his assistant, who knew he had never shown interest in the sword before. However, now it seemed a new curiosity had awakened in him, so he immediately received a warning about Pavel's body, since they were Friesen's subordinates and were responsible for maintaining control of the city. At that moment, Pavel's commander appears, annoyed that they are there watching, and asks them to leave, because they bother the soldiers. Marilyn, indignant at his haughty manner of speaking, tries to gain respect for her master, mentioning his status, but this only increases his arrogance, as he simply sees him as a bastard rat. Faced with the protagonist's calm gaze, this one starts to feel something different, but the protagonist was calmly, and this one starts to feel something different. Marilyn steps out to defend him, furious at the commander, who is amused watching her so angry, turning to look at the prince, from whom he expects a submissive reaction. However, the look he meets is murderous, contrasting with the weak prince who used to apologize, and feeling docilely, without even having the courage to look him in the eye, and now his enormous intimidating aura makes him sweat. Meanwhile, Callian approaches to ask him what his duty is. At that moment, some soldiers interrupted the scene, speaking ill of the prince, treating him as a nuisance, and belittling him. The commander took advantage of this not to answer the question, and simply continue on his way. However, to Marilyn's surprise, Callian raised his voice in a military tone and asked again what his duty was. The soldiers and their commander became nervous, until he decides to answer, affirming that his duty is to reinforce the royal family's forces and protect them. Under that concept, Callian clarifies that he is a disaster at both things, annoying the commander. But before he could say anything else, Callian cut a simple tree branch, preparing himself. He tells him that the training he saw was awful, and so moving at full speed, attacking him. The commander felt his aura, imagining how he would die if he didn't block the attack, and using all his speed. He barely manages to block it, astonished by all the power he injected into a simple tree branch. But before he could react with a simple flick of the wrist, Callian disarmed both, sending both weapons flying while readjusting his wrist. He tells him it's disappointing that the leader of Pavel couldn't predict any of his movements. As for his second priority, he finds it surprising that he wielded a sword and injured a prince, considering it an act of treason. The commander, terrified by that decisive and now murderous look, he doubts that he is really the prince he knows. With no other option, he kneels to beg for forgiveness, astonishing everyone, while internally he only thinks of avenging that humiliation. And this is how Jan waits for him, nervous and annoyed, because the supposed resistance training had ended with Callian returning riding a completely new horse, and he gives it to him to take care of, although it seems quite rebellious. He remembers that after the incident when everyone calmed down, he saw a fierce and wild horse that Blaze hadn't managed to tame. So he thought about continuing to annoy that enemy, taming the horse and taking it there. In this way, Callian asks his butler to hide the entire incident. However, Jan fears what will happen when they find out about the event and the horse. The protagonist tries to downplay it, but his body seems to be taking its toll, worrying his assistants. And aware of what will happen, he diverts attention, sending his butler to prepare everything for dinner. He is more worried about what he will do with the horse and if it bites. Meanwhile, a pair of faceless beings converse about the interesting twists that have occurred. They are happy to be able to have fun watching a worm writhe before dying, considering it much more entertaining than their original plan to pressure him until he gave in. And one of them crushes a rose between their fingers, thinking about what would happen from that moment on. Returning to Callion, he was in the same strange atmosphere as every day, which he still couldn't get used to, dining with his brothers, with Place being grumpy as always, but with less energy than usual, and the protagonist immediately assumed it had to do with the Queen's tardiness. And the Viscount's, although in the end he wasn't interested, as there was no way to change his expression. And then the sound of heels and an unmistakable aroma caught his attention. His gaze shifted to the true power behind that nation, marking the entrance of Selique Bryson, second wife and current Queen of Karis, accompanied by the Viscount, and her entourage, a recognized woman who ascended to the position after the death of the first queen, who died of illness and with the power of the Prisson family, took control of the Pavel squad, and managed to gather a large number of political allies, filling her board with key pieces. Believing that for someone like her, a third prince was simply a jester, and Zilike had been handling the commander's affairs. And apparently, he would receive compensation, hoping not to deal with such trivial matters in the future. Casting a creepy look before taking her seat, the protagonist felt the atmosphere become terrifying. The tension increased when the queen, addressing Callion, commented with surprise how much he had grown. The prince, expecting that reaction, replied naturally, stating that this is not the case, but he plans to keep growing much more in the future, ending with a big smile, which ends up making Randell uncomfortable and annoying the Brissons. However, Viscount Renan Brisson ends up congratulating him cheerfully on his new haircut, expressing that he looks very good and starting to chat casually with the boy, in a friendly manner, until a bang on his brother's table alerts him. The nervous Viscount hastily changed the subject and asked for food, which made it clear to Callion that the man was clumsy, and that the rumors about the Brisson family were true. And so dinner begins, but in the middle of it, Silique asks her son why he didn't tell her he couldn't tame his horse. He nonchalantly downplays it, and under his mother's insistence, simply states that it was a useless horse, trying to get up from the table, which provokes the anger of his sinister mother. Then, 3 weeks later, during the king's birthday celebration, everyone prepares for the event, awaiting the celebration and watching the princes get ready for the day. However, the royal tailor is very nervous and worried to see that Callion's measurements have dropped again, and complicating things even more. His nose starts to bleed, and the blood falls to the floor. Jan jumps terrified along with the other maids to attend to him. However, Callion insists he is fine, attributing it to his lack of sleep. Nevertheless, the tailor's concern increases upon seeing that he has lost a lot of weight in such a short time. Despite training, his resistance has also worsened instead of improving, and combined with the pressure he feels when using mana, he suspects something is wrong with his heart, worrying his servants, who hope he gets a medical checkup. And although Callion tried to pretend he was fine, having a hemorrhage in front of so many people complicated his ability to keep deceiving them, giving up everything as lost, until Jan appeared as the savior of his life, though not his reputation, attributing the bleeding to being insane, and his strange hobby of picking his nose, which he repeats louder and louder so all the servants could hear, while an impotent Callion watched his reputation crumble. In the end, everyone was convinced that he wasn't sick, but rather a compulsive nose picker, and Jan winking, feeling complicit towards an irritated protagonist. And he recalled how, responding to Jan's affection and appreciation, he ended up telling him about his poor health condition and his relationship with the mana in his body. This led his trustworthy servant to shatter his image to save his secret, although in the end, he was grateful for it. And now, his only problem was the tailor, who was worried because his clothes were not ready for the event. Jan told him to take his time, since the prince still had things to do, and the tailor left happily to work. Meanwhile, the butler asked him if this was the day, making the protagonist think that if everything continued like this, they would soon discover his health status, and his only option was to find Aelorn at all costs. And so they arrived at the event, where the king would see the brothers one by one instead of doing it collectively. Callion was the first to enter before His Majesty Ramen Larun, King of Karis, to whom he politely introduced himself only to be epically ignored. Without returning his greeting, while reviewing documents, the monarch invited them to sit. Kalyan wished him a happy birthday, but he, without looking at him, just told him he looked good, dismissing him aside. However, he immediately remembers all his servants and how many care about him. In this way, he understood why the king wanted to see them separately, to avoid paying attention to them during the conversation, and observing how Ramain considered dedicating a moment to his children to be simply a waste of time. Realizing how damaged that family was. Starting with the king, a man who paid no attention to his children, the first prince, was indifferent to everything. The second arrived at the event drunk and without knowledge of etiquette. And finally, the person Ramain was waiting for appeared, Salik, who despite being late arrived entirely with a beautifully manipulative smile, demonstrating that she had enough power to scorn the king, and all of them in turn made up his list of main suspects. Observing them all gathered, wondering who would send their executioner. And so many talked about the prince during the event in the square, admiring his radical change in attitude, bearing and style compared to his brother, the second prince, who acted like a mere drunk. However, the party guests dismissed it, as that wouldn't change the hierarchies. Despite this, some felt that something had gone wrong, that something had drastically changed. When the entrance of the third prince was signaled, he walked proudly, followed by his faithful butler, Jan, and showing off his new look, with his bangs trimmed, proudly displaying those red eyes that made him resemble Safanian, in addition to wearing a large red brooch that represented a declaration that he would stop hiding. All this accompanied by a huge smile. He immediately noticed that all eyes were on him, assuming he looked exceedingly good in that outfit, getting overly excited, thinking that Taylor Zetnan would be very happy to see him. Kalyan, on the other hand, knew well that they were watching him because of his expensive jewelry, which were the only ones he couldn't convince Zetin to remove, thinking he looked like a Christmas tree. Although he insisted that he looked very good, as he continued walking, the protagonist became interested in his butler's family, who apparently lived partly in Karis, the capital of the kingdom, and the rest in the outskirts. They wondered if they would go see him at the castle, to which he replied yes, if they sent an invitation. However, he quickly changed the subject to talk about how long they should wait for Raven. Kalia did not understand the reason for diverting the conversation, but respecting it, he opted for the most logical thing, and he tells him that he doesn't know either, and that he is waiting for the right moment. Besides, he was hoping to see someone, which astonished his butler, and although his intention was only to look for the Sigrid family, the only ducal family of Karis, and the first patriarch of the kingdom, powerful and loyal for 500 years, a story that impressed him as much as when he was a baron. And now, with both waiting excitedly until someone arrives who, according to Jan, was exactly who he was waiting for, Duke Suleiman Hun Sigrid, who was walking around with his cup in hand. Kalyan was clear, he liked loyal people, but he also wanted to gauge his intelligence, and he released a little mana, which Suleiman detected immediately and traced directly to him. Jan, astonished, thought the Duke had already taken notice of him. However, despite recognizing his ability, it wasn't time yet, and they chose to ignore him. Meanwhile, Ramain toasted in gratitude for those who had arrived, while Kalyan and Jan went down to meet the smart and obedient Raven, who only behaved like this when he was near the protagonist, heading towards the main entrance, from where they heard an argument between the guards, who wouldn't let the person they were looking for in, Ilian, who was annoyed because they wouldn't let him pass. And according to the soldiers' orders, they cannot let him in without an invitation, and they also discriminate against him because of his clothing, which seems to amuse the mage, who, feeling discriminated against, begins to withdraw. Concerned, Kalyan watches, as the mage seems to be looking for a reason to be expelled from the place, deciding to follow him before he leaves, ignoring Jen's warning, who reminds him that the king has ordered that no one can leave during the festival. This complicates the situation for the protagonist, who upon seeing his target move away, dashes off at full gallop, entrusting his butler to stop the soldiers, although he has no idea what to do. While Kalyan urges his steed, Raiden, they end up jumping over the soldiers who try to stop him, managing to leave the city, causing all the guards to prepare to capture him. Meanwhile, Jan, frustrated, tries to figure out how to help, remembering his boss's orders. And in this way, he finally focuses on his main mission as an assistant, protect the prince. With determination, he raises his voice and orders the soldiers to stop, affirming that Duke Sigrid has allowed him to leave. This annoys the soldiers, who ask him how he can make such a claim. Then, Jan lets his hair down, revealing himself as the eldest son of Duke Sigrid, and later that night, outside the festivities, the loud laughter of Duke Selig resonates, mocking his ashamed son, who patiently waits for his father to finish laughing. But he can't help it, as he finds it amusing to see how his son executed such an intelligent move, despite being the same young man who once left to become a child's nanny, congratulating him. However, Jan, still ashamed and worried, fears that this could ruin his family's relationship with the king. Sully, on the other hand, is not interested, as his strategy is simply to say nothing. His response confuses his son, who listens attentively while his father explains that he knows Ramin well, a cautious man who will analyze the situation. And on one hand, accepting the Sigrid's help would strengthen their friendship, but at the same time, not punishing this action could cause him problems with the Brisons. His only logical move is to bury the problem and not mention it again. Meanwhile, Elon seems annoyed at being chased by the third Prince of Kairos, asking him why he insists so much on following an old man, which the protagonist finds to be a bad joke, as the subject looks too young thanks to having reached the seventh circle. So he asks him if he will return, but soon both begin to speak in strange codes, which makes the protagonist feel insulted. Immediately after, he criticizes Elon for his attitude, which surprises the latter, as he perceives in Callion a determined young man. And interesting, and yet when he least expects it, he notices something strange, approaching quickly. Before he can react, he takes Callion by the hand and injects his energy into his body, causing intense pain in the heart. Callion feels the mage's aura flow inside him. Full of pain, he pushes him away, left exhausted. Elon understands him with a poetic phrase, stating that the wind cannot be completely stopped, even with the doors closed. The protagonist realizes that his condition has been discovered, and recognizes that he is right when he states that his mana is blocked. However, Elon, the problem goes beyond that, and he remembers that his mission in that place was to bother the rulers of Kytes, who mistreat mages, despite being descendants of dragons. His only intention was to introduce himself and leave, so that they would feel in their ego the loss of the greatest mage in history. However, his destiny seems to have changed because of a young prince whom he doesn't know whether to ignore. So he finally asks him what he wants. Callion, knowing he cannot lie, tries to recruit him to help him, as he is aware that his life will soon be in danger. Aelin understands him when he sees that Callion is a perpetual third prince, hated by all and surrounded by enemies. So he seals the area around them with a silencing spell to be able to converse, which astonishes the protagonist. He notes that he hasn't needed to use spells to do it, thus recognizing his power. And at that moment, the mage asks him if that is his only objective, or if he truly wishes to eliminate the source of the problem. And with great confidence, the protagonist replies that for now, he only wants to stay alive, and that later, he will take care of the root of the conflict. He even contemplates the possibility of taking the throne at some point to achieve his goal. This astonishes Elon, who is amused to note that the boy doesn't even aspire to the throne, but only sees it as an option despite being a dying prince. And the situation strikes him as funny, because Callion, the prince, resembles Cephanion, and he believes he could help him fulfill his purpose. And determined, he asks the protagonist for a formal invitation. He is enthusiastic, bows to him, and invites him to become his mentor. Elon, intending to save him, accepts. For his part, Jan is still conversing with his father, and asks him if he has made sure that no one in the palace knows his true identity. Seely cheerfully assures him that this is so, which relieves Jan, as he knows that if anyone discovered it, they would not allow him to remain by the prince's side. However, he is now also distressed and asks about Lee. Seely assures him that she is fine and that she has taken over the leadership he abandoned. Still, he downplays it, affirming that even if he wants to stop playing the butler, he will be welcome back. However, he also knows that this will not happen soon, so he says goodbye. However, he assures him that they will see each other again in 3 months, which worries his father, who thinks he plans to give up his position as a servant, asking him if he would seriously let Callion go. Jan silently just remembered that the prince would soon turn 15. His father seemed to understand him and tried to cheer him up by telling him the nickname of his family, and enthusiastically explained that they were known as the elephants of Kyries, because just like elephants in the wild, they usually do not compete for the throne. But with their power, they were capable of bending any beast. The boy didn't understand anything, until his father hugged him tightly, assuring him that the name he had sold was powerful enough to allow him to do whatever he wanted. Jan felt happy for those words, until his father remembers that he also caused him to worry a lot about him. So as compensation, he gives him a big bear hug, crushing him so much that he thinks he's going to die. Sometime after all that fraternal affection, Jan got ready to say goodbye, calling him Duke, which annoyed his father, who with the same formal tone ordered him to leave, and both said goodbye, promising each other they would see each other very soon. So the boy leaves, leaving the man annoyed by having to deal with his son's stubbornness. Worthy of a Sigrid. Still, he couldn't help but feel intrigued by how much Callian had grown, and he doubted what his goals really were. The next day, a carriage catches everyone's attention, recognizing it by a logo with 7 flowers and a silver staff. It belonged to someone who had worked for the kingdom of Riverand, and who was also a good friend of the king. No one understood why he was there, and some thought that perhaps the monarch was finally planning to compete against the Bryson family. All this anticipation was due to the triumphal entry of Aelin Manseal, who descended from the carriage with a radiant bearing, walking through the city with great interest in his disciple's plan, whom he had summoned that day at 9:30 a.m. And his intention was clear, to cause a stir among the nobles, something he himself planned to do, but which ended up getting ahead. Upon arriving at the royal palace, an entourage of servants welcomed him on behalf of His Majesty. Shortly after, he was led before King Ramin, who was astonished to hear Aelin's request, wanting a place to live in the city. For the king, having a power like his was convenient to compete with his wife. However, he didn't understand why he had suddenly appeared and doubted his true plans. The mage replied with a big smile and told him that during the previous night, on his walk through the square, he had encountered a black cat with red eyes. Although the king didn't quite grasp the metaphor, he listened attentively when Aelin stated that he would teach magic to said cat, and that he also wanted to create a pleasant environment for him. So he had to start by helping the owner of the house. In summary, Aelin wished to take Callian as his disciple and teach him magic. However, since he couldn't practice with him all day, he decided to offer his assistance to the king to prevent the Bryson family from trying to stop him. The monarch accepted and started looking for a place for him to stay, and seeing the chaos his own palace was, he considered that there was no way the situation could worsen, so he thought it was a good decision. Even so, he doubted the mage's reasons for having chosen Callian, as he didn't see him as someone special. For Aelin, on the other hand, the boy was special, uselessly special, even in his illness. He seemed to see nothing normal in him. However, in the king's eyes, he was nothing more than a frightened little boy who even feared horses. Not believing he would be capable of following him to ask him to teach him, this annoyed the mage, who noticed that the king only spoke based on what he had heard. Ramin insisted that if the boy truly stood out in something, he would have heard about him. This irritated Aelin even more, who with evident frustration asked him if he at least knew the prince's stature. However, as soon as the door is touched, a huge shield activates, destroying the doorknob and startling the king, who angrily reproaches him for his magic in his castle. However, they don't give him time to even finish speaking when Jalon begins to list Callian's sickly characteristics. From his dry lips, shortness of breath, his skin with blue tints, to his nails with a violet tone. He had noticed all of this barely in their first encounter. He had also noticed the alterations in his clothes, which, considering they were made in advance, Callian must have lost a lot of weight in a short time, and currently wasn't even able to stand with his eyes open due to dizziness. All this started to worry the king, and the mage left him a clear warning. If he continued to ignore the situation, he would lose everything. Meanwhile, Canyon was sleeping exhausted, with an intense pain in his chest. Meanwhile, in his room, a maid brought him food. Even though he hasn't woken up yet, Jan found her outside and offered to take it to him himself, finding him still asleep, when suddenly an arm with a mysterious aura appears. It is Elon, who very casually asks him if the protagonist is still asleep. For a few seconds, Jan remains motionless, until he reacts with fright, throwing the tray into the air only to catch it again with great skill. Meanwhile, Selin moves as stealthily as a ghost, and Jan complained about the mage's courtesy, who kept moving around there, aware that it was forbidden for mages to enter the palace. And Terado thought he had teleported, although for the mage it was a bit more complicated than that. However, the butler was not interested in him, asking him to leave, as the prince was not in condition. But suddenly, he got very close to his face, telling him they already knew each other, back when Jan was a child. On his trip to Roberin, recognizing him as a baby elephant. Then the boy remembered how his father happily assured him that it would be impossible for anyone to recognize him, only to see that one day later, he was recognized easily. And when Callan suddenly woke up, talking to his butler, who, surprised, informed him that he had a visitor, his professor, who quickly approached to hand him a bag with several pearls, recommending one daily, and he gave him his medical diagnosis, indicating that Callan had two problems, the first being that he couldn't control his mana, and the second, his extreme weight loss. He was astonished to see how easily his professor could see through him. The mage asked him if he possessed the power of Sepanian's blessing, to which the prince replied that he believed so, due to both his healing ability and his affinity for magic. However, recently he had thought that its effects were wearing off, believing it was due to his heart problems. His professor told him that it could be a strange combination, which confused Callan, who thought that in that case the blessing was what protected his heart, limiting his use of mana, since both life and mana came from the heart. However, Aelin made it clear that his healing was still working, and that his heart was fine, and that his mana wasn't blocked, and Sepanian's blessing was still there. It was just using all its resources for something else. Callan, frightened, understood. He was being poisoned. Elon confirmed his doubts, stating that the blessing was the only thing keeping him alive, pushing his power to the limit to protect his heart, and trying to control his use of mana, thus increasing his discomfort. But for Callan, his anger went further, since in the timeline, the prince had been eliminated by hanging, although he was already poisoned, with everything logically planned in advance, which filled him with frustration just thinking about why they decided to give such a painful end to a child, that he was going to die anyway. Aelin watched his expression in astonishment, seeing in his eyes a bloodlust not typical of someone so young, doubting who he really was. However, Callan quickly changed his expression and asked him if that was the antidote. The mage nodded, assuring that although he had prepared it in a hurry, he was sure it would work. However, the prince had another question. What would happen if he drank both the poison and the antidote? Elon was startled, because in that case, the symptoms would only lessen. For Callan, that was enough, which further disturbed his master, who didn't understand why he wanted to do something like that. And he asked him if he knew the culprit. The prince only assumed that the poison came from the tea he drank every morning. Drinking it in front of everyone was the simplest way to ensure he consumed it, understanding that perhaps the original Callan had also realized this. And by refusing it, he forced his executioners to find another method to eliminate him. So if he wanted to change things, he preferred to know the methods that could cause his extermination. For this reason, he told his master that until he discovered the exact method, he should continue drinking it. His professor doubted that was the only reason, and it wasn't. Callan was also thinking of protecting Jan and his servants, since they would be the main suspects. Meanwhile, the real culprit was someone he was sure would not be discovered. And despite this, his master was confident that the baby elephant would be fine, confusing Callan, who received no further information. And upon understanding his intentions, the mage asked him what his plan was. The prince remembered when he was a baron, and was often scolded by his manipulative father who gave him war lessons. One of them told him that if he took someone else's trump card, he had to give something in return. That advice gave him an idea for his next move, asking his master to escort him out of the palace the next day. Meanwhile, Place rested peacefully, drinking a glass of water, trying to get rid of his annoying mother, who entered arrogantly, barely containing her eye when she informed him that Callan had acquired a powerful master, causing a stir among the aristocrats. But Place couldn't care less, and his mother, with a threatening look, made it clear that he must not waste all the effort she had invested in him, and that he should prepare immediately, warning him as she left that with all eyes on him. He could not disappoint her. Frustrated, Place contained his anger until, under pressure, he ended up shattering the glass, injuring his hand. All his assistants worried about him, but he furiously kicked them out of his room. Then he remembered Callan, and his anger grew more intense with every second. Then the festival begins, with the king greeting his people and receiving cheers. And birthday congratulations. Queen Silica is also in the royal procession in a carriage, while the princes rode individual horses. surrounded by numerous assistants who pay attention, especially to one in particular, the renewed and cheerful Prince Callion. He advances alongside his butler, who is still worried about his health, although he no longer looks as pale as before. While observing the animated crowd, his attention focuses on two hooded figures with silver hair near them. This image brings back memories of the man who saved his life in the final battle, his friend Kiri. Unable to look away, his distraction causes his hair to become unruly and refuse to advance, forcing Jan to deal with the situation. When Callion finally snaps out of his trance, looking confused by the commotion, and tries to control Raven, who seems to perceive his rider's will. However, Callion clarifies that it is not yet time, just before seeing the hooded figures disappear, finally moving forward, deciding to meet up with his friend. Meanwhile, Melfir Palun, owner of an emporium, welcomes the royal family and promises them a great show. To Callion's surprise, the gentleman has organized the jousting event, replacing the Bryson family, which has generated some tension between them. However, the prince shows no interest in the show. His mind was occupied with the memory of the news, predicting that Randall would end up injured at this event, which would condemn Palun. Unaware of the tragic fate that awaited him, Palvun kindly guides the royal family to their seats. However, Callion notices that they are about to pass under the chandelier, which will cause the incident, and he wonders how such a large object hasn't been checked by the knights, especially those of Pavel, who are supposedly prepared for these situations. And thinking about it, he remembers his annoying commander, and seeing the old man so cheerful, Callion considers that he should help him. So he stays behind, and as he passes by him, he suggests that he check the chandelier above his head. Palun, confused, examines the object closely, and thus the jousting event begins. While Ramen watches attentively, Palun is excited to have fulfilled his dream of being close to royalty, being determined not to waste the opportunity. However, they feel Callion's distant gaze behind their backs, and later Palun watches horrified as a cut rope, which, had it not been inspected as the protagonist indicated, would have fallen brutally onto Prince Randall. Terrified and grateful but doubting, he asks how Callion knew what was going to happen. The latter smiled upon seeing that Palun made the wise decision to leave his place, next to the king, to inspect the chandelier. However, he doesn't understand what Brison's purpose was in attempting such an act, and at that moment, turning around, he observes Place staring fixedly at him, looking to start a conversation where Place disdainfully states that he doesn't even know him. While the show continues, the spoiled prince loudly declares and clarifies that he is disgusted by the vulgar blood running through Callion's veins, and everyone present hears these words, leaving Randall surprised, the queen completely frozen, and Ramen interested in the situation. However, the best reaction is that of the protagonist, who seems to have felt something in his feelings from that comment. However, it's an excellent performance by Callion, who smiles, seeing how play unintentionally turned out to be useful. Meanwhile, Ramen tells his wife to stop biting her tongue to avoid speaking. She is furious, as her son did exactly what she warned him not to do, and upon turning to look at him, she only finds an unconcerned attitude, which disconcerts her. Understanding that the boy did it intentionally, and sooner than she thought, she began to hear other nobles murmuring about Blaze's lack of respect, whom many are already planning to stop supporting. Instead, their gazes begin to turn towards Callion, whom they consider a better option, since he has Elon's backing, and the show concludes. Ramen, for his part, seems to omit any opinion about what happened to Blaze. The protagonist also notices that Queen Silica shows no concern for the failure of the plan to harm Randall. This makes her wonder if she really had something to do with it, and she remembers that in the past, while playing chess with her superior, they argued about this incident. On that occasion, Berun firmly maintained the idea that it was an attack against the royal family, but his superior, moving his pieces, showed him how a strategy would be too crude and shameless. It looked more like an obvious attempt to incriminate the second merchant force of Kyries, Delos Palun, and by eliminating them, the biggest beneficiary is the first merchant force, led by Renan Brison. Returning to the present, Callion asks Jan about the Delos Palun business. According to his butler, these are mainly based on the exploitation of diamond mines. With this information, Callion connects the dots with the disappearance of Old Man Palun. The Dryzen ended up taking ownership of diamond distribution. In this way, he concludes that Renan was certainly responsible. However, not allowing Palun to be eliminated, he is determined to keep him alive to continue using him, which transmits a terrifying vibe that the old man immediately perceives. And so the protagonist asks his assistant to cancel all his plans, although he knows they must attend a ball. So Kalyan must pretend to be emotionally hurt by Place's words, moving his butler, thus managing to convince him to return to the palace. Meanwhile, Ramin sits, meditating on Elon's words about his son Place, and remembering when he held the hand of Kalyan's dying mother, who passed away, distressed about her son's well-being. And his reflection is interrupted by the arrival of his servants, who announce the queen's visit, who wastes no time, enters the room, followed by a maiden who hurries to clean the table holding 2 cups, confusing the queen with Ramin, downplaying the presence of another guest. Wanting to get to the important part, knowing what his wife really wants, Silica hastily takes a seat and requests that the Dreesens will be responsible for the incident that day, with the intention of helping Place's position. However, the king, noticing her attitude, doubts and understands that she has other intentions, so he asks her what exactly those responsibilities are. With a malicious look, she offers to grant a prize to Count Pollen for the great show he provided. Ramin, upon hearing this, asks her what she is planning. She, with a huge fake laugh, insists that the Breeson family assumes responsibility for the incident. Ramin observes how she prioritizes Place's position and still maintains her arrogant air, and asks her how she plans to achieve it. With total certainty, she offers the exclusive horse supplies and the management of the Breeson stables. The king is paralyzed upon hearing how she gives up such a valuable asset, and immediately recalls his conversation with Elon moments before, when he warned him that a small incident would not be enough for Silica to give up the horses, but he assured him that she would offer an equivalent exchange. And so back in the present, the king can't help but admire Elon's foresight, or perhaps his son's. Thus calmly, the king asks the queen that at the party that night, she enter the hall with Blaze. Upon this, Silica reacts nervously, although she affirms that this will please the young man. And so that night both make an entrance together. The count receives his prize, and throughout the room, they comment on how desperate Silica seemed when negotiating in favor of Blaze, losing too much for the Breeson family. This situation brings back Kalyan's interest from the powerful, who begin to reconsider their alliances. This leads a surprised protagonist to see an insane amount of gifts in front of him, which amuses him, since it means that the Friesen's power is diluting. However, he has no interest in forming alliances with people who change their minds so quickly. So he orders Jan to send everything to the Mages Association, except for the 2 gifts sent by Mr. Pulun, which the butler quickly finds. One of them is a huge, colorful collar full of jewels for horses, making Callum think that Jan is spreading strange rumors about his tastes. She affirms that it's not entirely false, but she only told the gentleman that the protagonist adored his horse, seeing that Raven will wear something much more expensive than what he wears. However, it is not enough for him, as it is not comparable to the value of saving the gentleman's life. So he asks his assistants to find the price of the collar to buy it, which confuses Jan, assuming he liked it a lot. However, if it comes to taste, Kalyan is more interested in a strange and gloomy carnivorous flower, so big that Jan can barely hold it. And upon checking the sender, they discover that it comes from a Mages Association. The protagonist doesn't understand why Mages expert in creating beautiful things would send him something like that. Intrigued, Jane looks for the usage instructions, and inside she observes that the plant moves subtly. Finally, he finds a note, which tells him that upon dying, the flower expels pollen throughout the room. And right at that moment, a maiden was passing by there, when suddenly Kalyan spills all his tea. Yane worriedly asks if he is okay, but the prince remains calm. The only one bathed by the liquid is the flower. Believing they are both safe, since probably CT would also have poison, then the maiden gets nervous upon hearing them, and discreetly tries to move away the evidence of the dead flower. But Kalyan, with a grim look, prevents her from doing so. The next day, Aelin and Kalyan rode towards the outskirts of the palace, and Kalyan thanks him for remembering his request, which was difficult for the mage to ignore, considering the bravery he showed by deciding to take both the poison and the antidote. And he observes that he looks much happier than when he is in the palace. Kalyan, for his part, thanks him for having taken him out after so long, although he almost confesses that he has never actually left there. and he also doubts that his father authorized his departure. Elon suggests not exactly, since by that time his father must already be aware. And worried, Callian tries to protest, but realizes he did something similar with, so they both end up on the same wavelength. Yellen expresses his concern about whether the prince is still taking his medicine, to which Callian reassures him, assuring him that yes, and that he feels much better, hoping this way to make nervous the person who has been poisoning his tea, whom he plans to trap with the trick he prepared using the pollen from the carnivorous plant. His master, surprised by his cunning, tells him he really doesn't need help, but Callian clarifies that he is still grateful for the gift of the plant. And with this, both prepare to take separate ways. Callian puts on a hood, while his master says goodbye, reminding him that he can look for him at the nearest Mages Association when he finishes his business. And so each one moves away in opposite directions. And later, after passing by a blacksmith shop, Callian obtains his new custom-made sword. And now he walks towards a dark alley in search of information, guided by the memory of his previous life, and of how Secritia sent secret spies to other nations to keep them under surveillance. These agents were really trained to gather information and eliminate any necessary threat, being an organization founded by his father and himself. Upon arriving at a rental shop, he remembers how he raises his spies to be relentless and brutal. Therefore, if they discover them snooping around the base of operations, he doubts he will manage to leave there alive. Added to this is the problem of his striking hair color and eyes, which make him stand out too much. Seeking to be discreet, he enters the shop and finds numerous caged birds. The person in charge receives him and asks if he is interested. In a carrier pigeon, Callian rejects the offer and instead points out that there are some sleeping birds. And the person in charge continues the conversation in code, and the protagonist responds fluently, which makes the man's expression become increasingly serious. Finally, he asks what he is looking for. Callian replies that he needs bird food, to which the person in charge feels as if he has it available. However, with superhuman speed, he threatens him with a dagger to his throat, stating that no bird has arrived recently. Callian, finding himself threatened and without chances of winning a close combat, decides to continue with his tricks, stating that he just left the nest, and according to Secritia's coded messages, this was a way to ask for information from a rookie, which convinced the person in charge, who lowered his knife and asked him whose bird it was. For this reason, he had to use a name to pretend to be from Secritia, calling himself the Bird of Nebulade, aware that with that they surely would not discover him, asking the person in charge for food, which in this context translated to information, using his country of origin, Secritia, as a pretext to gather data about Kairos, specifically about the prince, and so the person in charge takes him to a secret place and grants him the alias White Eagle so he wouldn't forget when they met again. And Callan chose Red Mist. Then the old man asked him what food he was looking for. The protagonist asked for information, which had to be paid immediately before he could even say what he was looking for, although he felt like he was being scammed since he hadn't even requested anything. However, apparently it was a standard price, so with no other options he paid and received the information. And although he doubted its veracity, the person in charge affirmed that that was the only thing related to his request. In this way, the protagonist decided to move forward, saying goodbye to the White Eagle, who with a big smile told him to take care in this cruel world. However, Paracallion, who perfectly knew the world was cruel, was also aware that the old man in front of him was also a very dangerous person. And riding through a town, he saw a large number of people gathered, hoping not to attract attention. He tried to cross the bridge quickly. However, someone stopped him dead in his tracks, annoying him. Despite this person was very courteous and asked him not to interrupt the path of the dead. And it was then that he realized they were in the middle of a funeral procession in the city, a tradition in Karis, where they placed flowers with candles on the rivers, hoping they would follow their course. But if someone dared to cross the bridge at that moment, it could cause the souls of the deceased to be lost. It was something similar, and at the same time different from what happened in his native Secritia, where they placed a special flower called Sinistar on the graves. This bloomed white during the day and blue at night, conveying the message that there must be a separation between the living and dead, a moment that made him nostalgic, and he wondered if his brother would have placed one on his grave, or if time had reversed before he buried him. and he watches as the flowers continue on their way, feeling that his spirit had lost its way, until the man who had stopped him thanked him for having waited and allowed him to continue on his way. The protagonist understood that he was currently only a third prince of Kairos, who assured the hooded man that the souls would rest in peace, and stated that he would pray for them before leaving. Then the hooded man recognized him, momentarily ignoring his companion until one of them called him by name. Arsene had a fleeting memory of that honorable mage, who promised to remember the king of Secritia before becoming his executioner, and removing his hood, seeming to recognize that soul. Although in the end, he only thought that Kalian was a good person. And so the protagonist walked through the town, seeing hundreds of businesses bearing the name Sephanian. From Sephanian's food, Sephanian's deep sleep, or Sephanian's rest. But it coincided that the intense aroma of Sephanian's alcohol was already too exaggerated. This confirmed the information from the secret agents that terrified his past life, who mentioned how the dragon woman's man was everywhere in an unhealthy way. And upon entering the place, a subject approached to adjust his seat, but he refused the offer because his destination was the 4th floor of the building, and the receptionist understood and took him immediately, wishing him fun. The protagonist entered and left his coat, and remembered that the only information he requested from the White Eagle was the place where illegal activities occurred in the city. And moving a box, he opened a secret passage, and given that it was in a building of only 2 floors, he understood that his destination was underground, descending the stairs little by little, looking for something stronger than a simple gambling house, but something more sadistic. Arriving at the place he was looking for, where an excited crowd watches a fierce fight between 2 warriors battling to the death. In an underground betting ring, all the bettors were thrilled to see blood splashing everywhere, filled with shouts and worried only about generating profits with their favorites. And finally, there was a winner. Gerald, the damned one, who seemed to be an aggressive beast, lacking humanity in his eyes, and the waitresses happily handed out drinks, while the announcer informed that they could soon collect their prize. Others furious for having lost, as they dragged out the defeated fighter as if he were trash, and with the smell of blood impregnated. In the atmosphere, people begged for another fight to recover their money or simply celebrate the death. Kalia could feel nothing but disgust, and at that moment, an usher arrived to collect the entrance fee and assign him a seat, calling a waitress to take care of him. This is a beautiful and young girl who apparently cannot speak, dragging him to her table and trying to communicate with gestures. Upon leading him to the table, Callan noticed that her ears had been cut off and that they clearly forced her to dress that way. And she also had a tracking device, feeling confused by so much brutality, until the waitress adorably gestured to him. Apparently, he had to bet by placing money on one of the colors on the tray, so seeking to go unnoticed, he decided to bet on black. The rules of betting were simple. Money was placed, 2 men fought, there was a winner, and the bettor recovered double his investment. And that's how he doubled his money, again and again, astonishing even the waitress, because of the mountain of coins he accumulated, which drew everyone's attention. However, his objective there was not to earn money, but to find someone. So thus, the last fight was announced, which receives double the bets, mentioning the return of Hans the Hammer against the unreachable boy. Callian immediately recognizes the latter as the man who fought for money until his sister died. Kiri, to whom he offered to become a knight, and ended up being his sword, the king's sword, and the man who gave his life for him. And so the attendees fan the flames, shouting for the hammer to eliminate his rival, and increase their dividends, surprised that Kiri was still alive. After receiving a monumental amount of beatings, Hans, for his part, expected to humiliate the rookie bettor, deciding to make him lose all his money. While watching from a distance, as he smiled confidently, Hans made it clear to Kiri that because of him, a simple rookie would lose all his money. Just when the order to start the fight was given, Hans rushed into the attack. Kiri tried to block, but it all turned out to be a trap to connect a left hook, barely managing to react in time, or maybe not, as Hans with great speed changed his move to a spinning kick that hit squarely, leaving him seriously injured. The attendees shouted for him to finish him off, while a worried Callian at his table watched his friend seem to be at a disadvantage in a swordless fight. Even so, he was confident that he should be able to control the situation, and Kiri, upon trying to attack again, fails, receiving a knee strike from Hans, who annoyed because his rival is extremely tough like a cockroach. he begins to deliver a series of brutal consecutive blows to his face, leaving him against the cage, one strike away from the finish. Kiri seemed finished until Callan shouted from his table, giving him instructions for the fight. Thanks to this, he managed to evade the blow and counterattack against the stomach, leaving hands semi-crazed, and immediately followed up with a powerful right hook that shattered his opponent's teeth, winning the battle. To the misfortune and surprise of everyone, the big favorite had fallen, causing the attendees to protest over their lost bets, while Kiri turned, and his eyes met the excited gaze of the protagonist, who enjoyed his victory. However, at that moment, a subject appeared and asked him to follow him, taking him to his boss, a mobster who recognized his talent and ingenuity for making so much profit in a single night. However, with a clear threat, he stated that he wasn't comfortable handing over so much money to a simple child. This only provoked a laugh from Callan, who immediately deduced that they were not businessmen, but simple fools. And the mob boss became agitated by his attitude and ordered him to uncover his face. However, the boy warned him that if he did, things could become problematic. The mobster's henchmen threatened him, and the boss, even more intrigued, sent one of his subordinates to take care of the task. Just as he was about to remove his hood, something hit his hand. It was a dagger, causing him to scream heartbreakingly, and everyone was terrified by the protagonist's homicidal aura, especially the boss, who realized they had made a mistake bringing a lunatic with a knife there. And seeing the situation, he tried to negotiate, suggesting delivering the money in installments. However, Callan preferred a different deal, leaving Kiri's debt settled. This didn't sit well with the mobster, especially since his superior might eliminate him if he gave up something like that, with a fighter who generated so much money. And yet, despite fearing the use of Callan's sword, he doubted he could do anything against so many men. Determined to intimidate him, the mobster tried to threaten him, but before he could act, a gigantic gust of wind destroyed his desk and his pants, courtesy of the protagonist's Laura. Terror seized everyone in the place, so they quickly yielded to his request, and immediately, the boss ordered his men to bring Kiri. Callan, for his part, remained firm, with a confident smile, although he knew his body couldn't withstand another attack of that magnitude. And when one of the mobster's men returned, he reported that Kiri wouldn't leave without Hina. At that moment, Callan remembered that she was the sister who had decided to leave for the other world on her own to free her brother. Kiri abandoned the ring after that event, carrying the eternal guilt of not having been able to protect her. Without saying a word, the protagonist made it clear to the mobster that he wanted her too. Agitated, he ordered that she be brought too, and so he ended up winning, offering to transport them himself. Although something else was missing, since Callan demanded his entrance fee and his capital from a visibly frightened mobster. And so they left the place with Kiri and Hina, who turned out to be the adorable waitress. Both siblings, however, felt some mistrust, so Kiri soon asked why the protagonist helped them. It was then that Callan removed his hood, revealing his true identity. Kiri recognized him immediately and instantly bowed reverently, apologizing for having distrusted him. However, Callan asked them not to lower their heads, as they didn't need to, recognizing both as semi-elf siblings without any possessions, who clearly lived a hard life. Then, he reprimanded Kiri for his bad rookie habit of exposing his shoulder when fighting, pointing out that it was a common mistake for beginners in the art of the sword, and he supposed he was looking to become a knight. Kiri contradicted him. His intention was not to become a knight, but to become a protective sword. Callan smiled upon hearing this, and without warning threw him a high-quality sword, and assured him that although he could not yet be a knight, at that moment he required him as his shield. And after leaving, he told him that if he really wanted to learn the art of the sword, he should look for him. And both siblings were confused by the fact that he had told them something like that. Callan, with a big smile, replies that he is just looking for a good sword, mounting the horse, while remembering the relationship he shared with Kiri, thanking him for his friendship and hoping to repay his sacrifice with this. On the other hand, at the Mages Association, Aelin is in his office, burning the report of the place's insult at the jousting event. And in the document, the mage changed the report that Callan told Pulun, his discomfort with a chandelier hanging over his head, which was later cut by the cut rope. This led him to start doubting how the protagonist possesses that kind of information. Just at that moment, the prince arrived with his usual innocent look, which did nothing but increase Elon's suspicions. Even so, he maintained his role, showing himself slightly indifferent upon noticing that he seemed to have been in a fight. Callian, however, stated that although something had happened, he didn't consider it a fight, but difficult business. And with complete calm, he leaned back on a sofa, thinking about how he now had Kiri, and the trap he had prepared to discover who was poisoning him was ready. And although everything was going according to his plan, he had a bad feeling, and Elon continued to observe him suspiciously, while he stopped preparing the issue manually to do it with magic, which excited Callian, who expected a mage's office to be more magical. Although his master didn't seem to enjoy stereotypes, like decorations with eyes that follow movements, or cauldrons with boiling potions, Callian admitted he would have expected something like that. But what broke the magical atmosphere the most was a sheathless dagger on the table. And upon seeing it, he understood immediately it was identical to the one he had bought. And his master, with a serious expression, asked him if he knew why that dagger was there, since it shouldn't be. Without prior warning, he activated his magic, lifting him and dropping him directly onto Callian. Aiming at his heart, he was unable to dodge it, and with the impact, blood spreads across the floor before Elon's eyes, who observes him with interest, surprised by the boy's speed. Despite his sickly body, Callian managed to block the attack, but his body couldn't handle so much, and he continued coughing up blood. It was then that Elon explained that this was a magical tool from Sephanian, capable of imitating the opponent's hidden weapons, clarifying that he never intended to eliminate him, but rather to confirm his suspicions, since they're strange and coincidental encounter, he thought it was mere chance. Until Ramin's comments about how the prince used to be terrified of horses, also the opinions of the nobles, who had noticed a great change in him, and his blood-filled gaze upon discovering that he was being poisoned, and the incident he managed to prevent at the jousting event, approaching to heal him, confusing the protagonist, who realized that his master's attitude was not due to distrust, but because he truly wanted to keep trusting him. With no other option, he decided to reveal the truth. He was not Callian, but Secritia. In this way, both caught up on the story. However, Aelin was still confused about the time axis, and doubted that the real Callian was still alive. Varen assured him that at first he also believed so, but the boy's presence remained inside him. And Elon remembered that when they met, Callian assured him he wasn't seeking the throne, so now he wanted to know his true objective. Calmly, the protagonist explained that he wanted to prevent the war since if Place came to power before knowing his plan with the time axis, history would repeat itself. Then Elon asked him if what he sought was for himself or for his brother Chase, making it clear that in that moment in Secritia, there was only one crown prince, born from a royal concubine while the queen had no son, stating that in this world there was no Berun, information that shocks the protagonist. So he understands Berun does not exist in his town or anywhere else in the world. Filled with doubts, he wonders if something went wrong with the time axis, if by going back he created some contradiction in space-time, although none of that matters, as he must admit it, he no longer exists. And that is why he ended up in Callian's body, a body that is still alive when he arrived, and now he understands why he still faintly feels him inside. At first he thought that, like him, someone might have usurped his body, and now he understands. If he is still here, there is no Berun, and if so, although he refuses to accept it, he is basically stealing someone else's life. Elon watches him worriedly, informing him that Chase is already the crown prince of Secritia. And just as the past he knew has changed, surely the future will also be different. But that being the case, the third prince of Kyrie is still in danger, so he must focus solely on that, and not on the prince of Secritia. The protagonist understood the message. Basically, his master was asking him to stop living in the past. However, he had been clear about that for a long time and assured Aelin that he shouldn't worry about it. Since the first day he opened his eyes as Callian, he had renounced his life as Baron. And yet with some uncertainty, he asked him if everything was fine now that he knew he wasn't really the third prince. Elon responded with a big smile, since the person who had formed a great alliance from the beginning was still him. Later, Callan asked his master if he knew about the time axis. Elon confirmed that he did, since a year ago Chase had asked him for advice on the artifact, for which he left Secritia in secret. However, he couldn't discover anything beyond the fact that it was an object created by man. For a long time, there were no advances in the investigation. Until a month ago, he received an urgent message from Secritia, informing that Lehai had disappeared, and the prince himself had said that he went back 10 years in the past, the same time that Kalyan had gone back. Realizing this, the protagonist blamed himself without understanding what had happened. Elon tried to calm him down, assuring him that for the moment they would not find an answer. Luckily, there was someone who knew even more than him and Kalyan, and they would soon see her, Sephanian herself. And with Rosalita's coming-of-age ceremony, where the birthday boy had to travel to Sephanian's home to announce that he was an official member of royalty, having the opportunity to know Sephanian's will. However, Elon made it clear that his priority was to stay alive, so he had to focus on that. Kalyan understood, and with determination prepared to implement his plan. When he returned home, Jan was waiting for him, worried and drowsy, but it wasn't time to sleep. And upon seeing the flower, Kalyan understood that it was time for the show. Without wasting time, he ran to the terrace, followed by his almost sleeping butler, where he remembers how that small plant was truly unknown, as well as its effects, and one of them was releasing pollen when it died. So he pretended to throw his poison tea on it to wither it. However, the plant was still alive, which meant that someone must have changed it. And now in front of him, the bright pollen of the flower began to spread throughout the castle, creating a beautiful landscape, and Kalyan smiled, since he would use that landscape to find the responsible party. And so the face would guide him to the true culprit, who was Silica. Then a strong storm fell, and the prince watched the rain descend until Jan entered the room. Bringing him his morning tea, Kalyan greeted him cheerfully with his clothes getting looser due to his weight loss. Jan was happy that for the first time the prince greeted him first, supposing that he had woken up early due to the rain. And meanwhile Kalyan tasted his tea, Jan too, and they were slightly different. And this made it clear to him, Silica had increased the poison dosage. With a smile, he asked his assistant if there would be any noble event next week, and he confirmed it with the clear date. And Kalyan, aware that after the event there would be a banquet where they would reveal the poison in his tea, he hoped that in the meantime, Silica would get as frustrated as she wanted, and once he finished the tea, he immediately ingested the antidote, arousing the butler's curiosity. However, Kalyan pretended he was consuming nutrients and suggested having breakfast earlier that day, and he already understood and prepared everything. And upon leaving the room with the tray in his hands, he turned the empty teacup, a feeling of anxiety invading him. Later, Kalyan noticed that Place had not appeared at breakfast since the incident in the theater, which is really convenient for his plans. And suddenly, seeing Randall by his side, he made a strange comment. The flowers were about to bloom. Randall was confused at first, observed Kalyan, then got up and left the dining room, clearly annoyed. And Yian understood why he mentioned the flowers. The prince pretended that he only remembered how his brother used to take care of the garden roses, assuring that it was nothing important. However, for Randall it seemed to mean something more. Then, amidst the rain, Kalyan arrived exhausted at a tree. His master Elon observed him, noticing how every day he lacked more air, and sarcastically asked him if he enjoyed masochism. Kalyan, without hesitation, attributed his insistence to not being able to live without training. And although this strange person asked his master why he was there, Elon replied that he had had a meeting with Ramen, which surprised the prince upon hearing how naturally he referred to the king. His master no longer seemed to like these kinds of formalities, being more interested in his plans. And so the prince had two requests for him. First, he needed 2 identities. Second, he had to investigate the death of the suspected nobles, and with both agreeing to mainly investigate those related to the Brisson family. Thus they understood. For Elon, neither request was difficult, but he doubted why Kalyan had rushed so much. And Kalyan explained to him that he needed him more than ever, since the poison doses had increased. Elon thought the prince was asking him to be his shield, but Kalyan didn't want him as such, but as a weapon, since through his memories he kept in mind the enormous power that the mages of Kyrie had obtained, who destroyed his nation, so he is determined to create a magical order. Elon did not fully understand Kalyan's request, since unlike the knights, mages were much harder to train, so he considered it too complicated an area. But for Kalyan, he knew perfectly well that it was possible, and he himself had seen the results of Ramen's idea in his past life, the creation of a mage's order, and despite the discrimination from other nobles, including the Vrysons, he managed to develop his idea calmly. However, once the mages' squadron was established, the king died under strange circumstances, and Blaze ended up inheriting the powerful squadron, which he knew very well during the war. But this time things wouldn't be so easy, as the Vrysons were more alert. Therefore, Kalyan would use the Temvir Anato as a negotiation tool with Silica. This strategy disconcerted Aelin, who couldn't figure out how he planned to carry it out. However, the prince couldn't reveal the details of his plan yet, so he simply tasked him with informing Ramen about his intentions, since Kalyan had to take advantage of the queen's small mistake to succeed in his negotiation. Meanwhile, the queen made it clear to Kalyan's maiden that she must increase the poison doses, insisting that she do it quickly, as she wanted to get rid of everything that bothered her. She, nervous and terrified, tried to comply with the order, and that whole scene was heard by Place, who didn't seem to take it well, approaching her to basically demand that the queen stop her actions, assuring her that they were not necessary. However, she replied coldly, stating that the one who really should be doing something hadn't lifted a single finger. And with her sinister look, she clarified that he had no right to tell her anything. At those words, the prince left furiously, while Ilika, with a malicious smile and a sadistic look, called him a coward, hoping that weakness wouldn't stand in his way. And when the day of the event finally arrived, Hina was especially cheerful, humming a song happily. Her brother Kiri noticed immediately, and using sign language, explained to her that they were excited to go to the palace, and that he eagerly awaited seeing the prince. For his part, Kalyan was being prepared for the banquet, which would follow the nobility meeting. His itinerary had already been given, but the prince had a special task for him. In this way, later, he walked with a firm step down a corridor, determined to put an end once and for all to the attempt to poison him, arriving at a table where he met gazes with his main antagonist, Silica. His objective was clear: it was time to begin a great change. Meanwhile, Jan galloped at full speed, remembering how his master had given him 2 envelopes, one to deliver to the Mages Association and another to Elrond. And while Kalyan attended the banquet, Jan had the mission to deliver them. However, despite his determination, a bad premonition invaded him, enveloping his body in anxiety. Trying to ignore it, fully trusting that the prince would be fine. But at the party, to everyone's terrified gaze, the prince lay on the floor, lifeless. And at the Mages Association, a cheerful sorceress named Aurea Saren informed Elon about all the discoveries she had made in her investigation into the family. Pryson, although they still couldn't understand how so many events had never been investigated. However, Elon had it clear: the lower-ranking nobles could never stand up to the Friezen, and Aurea understood that if someone tried to harm her, they would only join the growing list of victims of these incidents. In this way, both doubted what Kalyan's plan would be with this information. And at that moment, Jan entered agitated, thanking his luck for having found them both in the same place. Without wasting time, he handed them their respective letters. He read his calmly at first, but suddenly became agitated and demanded to know the location of the banquet. The confused mage informed him that he didn't have an invitation. However, the mage shouted at him that if they didn't hurry, his master could die. Since in the letter Kalyan told him that precisely that day he would negotiate with Silica, putting his life at risk, and asked him to save him if something went wrong. And so we see what happened an hour earlier, when Kalyan arrived to speak with Silica. Seeking an honest dialogue, she accepted, but arrogantly slammed her fan shut and violently struck the table, making it clear that even if they were sincere, nothing would change. The prince indicated that the only thing he wanted was a frank conversation, not an escort debate. Silica seemed disappointed, thinking the chat would be more entertaining, and looked down on him for his inferior blood. Convinced that it wasn't worth arguing with him, Kal-El interrupted, mentioning the poisoned tea, which he had patiently tried to drink, but found it too disgusting. She, with a sinister look, pretended not to know what he was talking about, giving him a very fake smile. And the prince replied with an equal one, stating that if that was the case, he would have to take measures to prevent it from happening again. Then he showed her a vial with a heart medication obtained from the White Eagle, and that it had a single purpose: to stop his heart for a moment being undetectable, pouring the entire contents into his tea, and explained that his blessing could only be carried out with one action at a time. Therefore, while protecting his heart from the medicine, all the poison he had been consuming would spread through his body, causing all suspicion to fall on her. However, instead of getting scared, Silica burst into hysterical laughter. Agitated, she stated that it wasn't the first time someone had done something similar, and she had always gotten away free of accusations. And arrogantly, Savannah boasted about having been the one who also eliminated Callion's mother. The prince, observing her reaction, asked her for the last time if she really didn't care if he drank the tea. To which, self-assured, Secritia told him to do it. Callion drank it, and she watched with a sinister and confident expression, convinced that no one could blame her, since even the king was afraid of her. And so they explained that Secritia, the queen who had everything, always got what she wanted, and the way she achieved it was none other than being a manipulative and cruel snake, eliminating anyone who stood in her way. Each of her moves left a pool of blood, seeing everything as a simple game board on which she moved her pieces. And as in any good game of chess, she still had to reach her final objective, the king. Visualizing ramen through his wine glass, feeling bloodthirsty, and with the banquet beginning, Callion started to sweat blood uncontrollably. Under everyone's watchful gaze, he collapsed on the floor. Agonizing, the queen, far from being moved, watched the scene with joy, and everyone in the room rushed to help him, desperately looking for a healer, while she enjoyed the show. And for her, just like many others before, the prince was nothing more than another stepping stone she had to tread on to reach her goal. The guards quickly checked the situation and concluded that he had been poisoned. Since the drink he had at the moment showed no traces of poison, they assumed that the poisoning had occurred before the event, then asking who had been with him. However, although many others seemed to know, they chose to remain silent to protect their lives. That cowardice filled the queen with satisfaction, as no one dared to say her name. Meanwhile, Ramen rushed to help his son, taking him in his arms and begging him to stay awake. Desperate, he urgently requested a healer. At that moment, Callion, agonizing, extended his hand, and the king immediately remembered his mother. Just like in her last moments of life, Freya had smiled sweetly at him and begged him to protect her son. And now the same scene was repeated before him, filling him with frustration and rage. Meanwhile, Secritia, with a terrible performance, feigned concern and fear, retreating to her palace. However, before she could leave, the king's voice resonated furiously in the hall, shouting the name of the person responsible for the assassination attempt on his son. Secritia, the atmosphere in the hall completely changed, murmurs turned into accusations, and several nobles began to recognize that they had seen her with Callion before the event. Despite this, the queen tried to pretend it was all a misunderstanding, arguing that the prince had always been a sickly young man. But Ramen wouldn't let her escape, remembering the day Callion's mother, Freya, died. At that time, Secritia had said exactly the same thing while taking refuge behind the Verizon Knights, asserting that it was still an illness. However, she calmly knows that no one will believe her that the boy was healthy. To support her claim, she asked the princes to share breakfast with Callion, who confirmed his state of health. Ramen tried to stop her, but she, with a sadistic look, reproached him for exaggerating too much for his son. And with a cynical expression, she affirmed that she was also worried about Callion, which enraged the king even more. Drawing his weapon, but before the situation exploded, a voice surprised Secritia. It was her own son, Place, who with absolute confidence declared that Callion had never shown any health problems, leaving the queen completely cornered. Just at that moment, the healer arrived, while Ramen begged, desperate for him to save his son. And Secritia tried to leave. The priest was about to use divine power on Callion, when suddenly, a magical shield blocked him. The barrier came from Elon, who almost breathless warned them that if they did, he would die. Ramen, agitated, demanded that they allow him to heal his son. But Elon warned him that there was a magic circle in Callion's heart. And he explained, as they well knew, if divine power and magic clashed, the best that could happen to him was that his heart would simply explode. The desperate king asked him for a magical alternative, but Elon firmly denied it. He couldn't do anything with magic, unless it was a mage with natural power. Finding himself without alternatives while watching Callion suffer, his mind was invaded by a grim memory. A scene where someone begged him for mercy, full of pain. Elon sadly observed Callion, who noticed the melancholy in his expression. The mage, with no other options, did the only thing he could do, lamenting having thought he would never need to use that spell again, filling the prince's body with magic, seeking only to alleviate his pain. While the city plunged into chaos, leaves began to fall from the sky like rain, an endless stream of news. Each of them carried a headline that condemned the souls singled out by the Friesen, directly blaming them for the tragic. and agonizing death of 37 people. The rebellion unleashed a true typhoon within the family, while the information spread rapidly, adding to the growing suspicions that Silica was responsible for the third prince's poisoning. And soon an enraged mob approached the Friesen houses, and amid furious shouts and torches held high, they demanded explanations for their barbaric acts. And in this way, the old stigma of not challenging the Friesen for fear of their reprisals seemed to diminish. Before the popular hatred, the crowd was holding Silica responsible for attacking Callian, making their objective clear: expelling her from the throne, letting her know through vandalism messages on her castle that their goal was to expel the queen. Meanwhile, Alien informed the king about the plan to spread the Vraisen's crimes, with the intention of pushing the queen to the limit, and everything was part of a larger strategy, whose next step surprised the king. What most disconcerted him was that his son had in mind the formation of a mage's squadron, precisely his original idea, while Callian rested in his bed, guarded by Jan, when he received the unexpected visit from Silica, who was surprised to find that the prince had already structured the mage's squadron so quickly. However, he thanked her, assuring her that thanks to her, he had had enough free time. This infuriates her, not understanding how, despite fighting between life and death, he sounded so well. And despite his apparent calm, Kalia was making a great effort sweating in his bed, but preferred to leave that confrontation for another day. However, Silica, instead, insisted on continuing the conversation, seeking an agreement. However, he rejected the proposal, since unlike the occasion when he offered to negotiate, now the circumstances had reversed, and he warned her to prepare for what was coming. Frustrated, she bit her lip, before stating that if the information was true, she would accept the consequences of His Highness's decisions. However, Callian slowly bursts out with a huge laugh, and ecstatically makes it clear that at no time did he need the queen's permission, since the die had already been cast. Silica, agitated, demanded to know his true intentions, and he revealed them without reservation, stating that they desired a nation governed by the descendants of Sephanian. For this, he would eliminate both Pavel's knights and every single member of the Vraizen in the castle. The agitated queen can do nothing against the boy's supposed plan, and by losing Pavel's knights, Silica loses half her strength, assuring her that she must give up that without receiving anything in return. According to Jan's contract, which is written down, and it is the sealing contract, which, as the protagonist explains, is etched in the heart, so if either of them breaks it, their heart will be the one destroyed, leaving the queen powerless and bound to it. Sometime after Callian woke up, he received a visit from Silica. Randall remembered this, while tending to his roses, delicately cutting one of them, and his mind took him back to the scene where Callian fell to the ground, agonizing, meeting his gaze. In this way, he understood the true meaning of that phrase he had heard before: the roses will soon bloom, realizing that from the beginning everything had been a plan to use him, which sparked in him a huge curiosity to discover how that flower would bloom. So determined, he prepared to follow his plan. However, he did not expect Blaze to step forward, seeing how things were starting to become increasingly different. For her part, Silica followed Tanita regarding Callian's proposal. He made it clear to her that if she broke the deal, her heart would shatter, leading her to an inevitable death, something that didn't matter to her in the least. Trapped under that pressure, she had no choice but to violently take the pen from Jan's hands and sign. With every stroke, a series of light flashes were unleashed in the environment, illuminating Callian's ecstatic face with radiance. At that moment, the contract was engraved in their hearts, and he, with a triumphant smile, affirmed that with this everything was ready. Silica furiously broke the pen and prepared to leave, but Callian stopped her with the final warning. He wanted to make it clear that he did not have a good relationship with his brothers, and that when Place intervened in the banquet, it was not for him. In reality, his son simply prevented the king from sending her to the beyond. She listened attentively, slightly changing her posture, but replied nothing else before leaving. Later, Aelin was there, visibly worried about what happened with Silica, observing Callian enthusiastically devouring a plate full of bananas, showing a huge appetite after having been so close to the underworld. The young prince, however, seemed cheerful and grateful for having been saved, which annoyed his professor. He made it clear to him that he had almost seen him again, but this time only at his funeral. Had it not been for the unexpected arrival of the half-elves at the banquet, Kyria and Hina, and also the fact that the young woman turned out to be a natural energy healer. Surprised by the revelation, Kalyan commented that all of that had been mere chance, since Kiria never mentioned anything like that in his past life. This made Elan thoughtful for a moment, until he exploded furiously, basically the protagonist being poisoned throughout his body, drinking a poison he got from somewhere, having only faith in blessings. Since he couldn't do anything, if it weren't for that chance, he wouldn't have mentioned it, spending a week dying without being able to do anything, and Kalyan tries to calm him, offering him a banana. But Estrella responds by throwing a scroll at him. Apparently, that document contained the identity certificates of the half-elves. Kalyan took it intrigued and began to read the names of Kiria and Gina, followed by the surname Varain, and he looked up surprised at his professor, who, without giving it much importance, explained to him that they simply needed a last name, and noticing that they were not just strangers in his life, he would surely approve. Kalyan enthusiastically thanked him sincerely, even more so when he noticed that the documents were not fake identities, but rather original certificates recognizing them as citizens of the territory, and Elon had achieved that with Ramin's help, which astonished the young prince, to whom his professor confessed that he was beginning to be known as the king's favorite son, something that began to circulate after the dramatic scene at the banquet, and the protagonist doesn't feel good hearing it because he knows it's something the real Kalyan should enjoy. This left him thoughtful for a long time, interrupting his reflection only to tell Jan to take away the banana peels. However, his servant approached with a serious expression and announced in a firm voice that he would stop serving him, leaving Kalyan completely in shock. And so the story goes back, a long time ago, when Jan was a small, innocent boy who happily used to greet his older brother, who was seriously ill. At that time, Jan seemed to have developed a strong feeling of guilt, one that he was slowly managing to leave behind, all because of his childish naivety with which he spoke to his brother about mundane things, like the chirping of the cicadas and telling him he should see them, although his brother, due to his condition, didn't seem happy with this suggestion. In his innocence, Jan overheard his father arguing about looking for alternatives for his son's treatment, seeking to contact Manasel's son. However, Sly was thinking about letting go of the impossible, making the little one begin to understand how painful it is to desire something with all your might, and not being able to reach it. Jan didn't understand it or didn't want to accept it, but his brother begged him to accept reality. He was dying little by little, and then he understood. That feeling of helplessness hurt too much. And one day a huge fire broke out in their home. Servants tried to protect Jan and keep him away from the fire. It all happened exactly on the day of his brother's 15th birthday ceremony. That grim scene before his eyes left him marked for life, and with no better option he secluded himself, spending many seasons in his confinement while waiting for the cicadas to sing again. Sly couldn't bear to see the state his son was in and forced him to go out. While carrying him in his arms, the heartbroken little one noticed in the distance a child with red eyes and a resigned look that caught his attention. And back in the present, Jan remains firm in his decision to let the prince go, who doesn't even know how to react, stuttering his words, trying to understand Jan's decision, confused by so much determination. But Jan is clear, since the prince never told him that what had been hurting him for so long was actually the tea he served him daily with joy. Guilt enveloping him for not having noticed it sooner. This sends him into a trance upon realizing that once again, he wasn't by the prince's side, remembering his brother's reproaches when he begged him to ignore the fact that he was dying. Kalen's voice tried to bring him back again and again, until with a loud shout, he ordered him to look directly at him. Jan raises his head with eyes full of tears and a confused expression. Then Kalen asks him to tell him who he sees in front of him, and Jan replies to the prince. He then takes him by the shoulder and makes it clear that he is no longer dying, and that since the day he woke up, he has been by his side, being the reason why he is still alive, thanks to the fact that he never ignored him. And contrasting with the light of a sunset, he tells him that he doesn't know much about his past, but he trusts that he will continue protecting him in the future, waiting for a confirmation from Jan, who, filled with emotion, falls to his knees and begins to cry like a baby. Kalyan tries to calm him. However, through sobs, Jan thinks he must apologize to his father, as he knows he will not be able to return as he promised. Kalyan extends his hand, triggering the memory of the day they met. Meanwhile, Jan determinedly promises to protect the prince for the rest of his life, still crying like a baby. And so, time passed, the butler cleaned the place, assuring the protagonist that he would take care of those who hurt him. For Kalyan, this is an exaggeration, but Jambar Ranchudo affirms that there is nothing he can do, causing the protagonist to try to calm him, expressing that elephants should stay away from wars. However, the little elephant doesn't grasp this and continues his tantrum, unintentionally mentioning himself as a member of the Sigrid family. It is then that he finally realizes that his identity has been discovered, increasing his tantrum, and asking him since when he knew. Kalyan replies that he discovered it by accident, although he no longer believes him and blames his father. And Kalyan, without giving it much importance, prefers to ask him to bring him a cup of coffee, while observing the clear difference in height between them, and assures him that with time he will surpass it. Then suddenly, we see a drop falling into the water, and in a kind of void is Berun Kalyan, confused, observing the original Kalyan with a smile. Both face each other in an empty world. For a time, they exchange glances, until the latter approaches him little by little, and with a big smile passes by his side, leaving him behind and ignoring him. Berun, bewildered, turns only to see Kalyan cheerfully approaching his butler, and his maiden, with whom he laughs cheerfully before looking back at him with a flushed face. Berun, with a confused expression, extends his hand, and the original Kalyan, confused at first, responds with a smile. But then that attitude changes, moving his lips as if saying something that astonishes Berun. Faced with Kalyan's wide smile, Berun still tries to cling to him, without success. The void falling, filled with light, and in that way the world seems to completely fade away. And back to reality, Kalyan seems to wake up during the night, and some time later, he prepares a funeral on the river, together with his master, Aelin, who is surprised by his definitive departure. He asks him if he has really gone. Kalyan, still astonished, didn't believe he would disappear once he had managed to save himself, while leaving a flower on the river. And he watched the sky with melancholy, regretting that he had left in such a hurry, remembering then the last words of the original Kalyan, who was giving him his life in exchange for him, continuing to fulfill his objectives. In this way, before completely fading away, he dedicated a great smile to him. And from the beginning, the one who truly woke up was Berun, who now feels sadness remembering how the child Kalyan saw his own life as a shackle from which he had finally freed, envying that enormous freedom. He asked him what he will do from now on, and the now soul Kalyan replies that there are still many things to prepare. Then he turns and asks him a favor, to help him live this second life properly. Meanwhile, in the river, the soul of the little mistreated one slips away to the beyond. Some time later, the plans were underway. With the dissolution of the Paddle Knights, Ramen was in charge of diverting rumors about the queen, and the imminent creation of mages' orders, which were led by Elon, advancing without setbacks. And so 3 months passed. To the service's surprise, Callan's clothes were already too small for him, accepting the situation, recognizing that they should call Zetin to make the necessary adjustments. Despite this, they decide to visit their father, who, now more interested in him, is surprised by how much he has grown, and the weight he has gained in that time, affirming that he looks good, which pleases the prince. Then he sits down to have tea with them and asks about Rosalita. Elon assures him that everything is ready, and taking advantage of his arrival, introduces him to the mage who will accompany him in the rite. At that moment, a man appears behind him, revealing his identity, Arsene Hertz. Immediately, a wave of bad memories invades the protagonist, while Ramen praises the mage as capable, and that he will be part of the squadron, suggesting that Kalyan get to know each other better on the way. Arsene eagerly awaits him, but Kalyan, fiercely gripping his clothes, tries to calm down. Clearly, he doesn't seem happy about the idea of traveling with the man who literally sent him to another life. Meanwhile, Aelin and Ramen discuss the time it will take to form the squadron and the name they should carry, for Kalyan's part. Instead of paying attention to them, he keeps watching Arsene with distrust. This one, instead, responds with a big smile. At that moment, Aelin directly asks the king if he has a name he would like to give the squadron, and nervously he thinks for a few seconds, moving his hand over his leg until finally giving his suggestion, calling the squadron Balkan. Upon hearing the name, Kalyan feels proud, although Elon instead mocks Ramen, hinting that he had already thought about it a lot beforehand, thinking they would have been in trouble if they hadn't asked. And Kalyan interrupts the conversation to ask a surprised Arsene if he likes the name Ramin suggested, or if it seems familiar to him. However, this one simply replies with a smile, expressing that he is a great man. Later in the soundproof shield, Elon is astonished to learn that part of Berun's history with Arsene. Intrigued, he asks him if he will do anything about it. However, Kalyan, with unwavering calm, prefers not to take action, although he perfectly remembers that Arsene sent him to another life. He literally feels calm, because the man he sees is very different from the one he knew in the past. And Elon tries to do something, but Kalyan already has a small revenge planned with an attitude that sends chills down his master's spine. Later, Pyulun reappears greeting Kalyan, who apologizes for having called him without mentioning his name. However, the gentleman does not seem bothered by it at all. In fact, he feels pleased to be the first noble the prince meets, assuming that he senses the reason for the meeting correctly, and hopes to score points with this. Then Kalyan directly asks him for the price of his life, asking what is the best product he has to offer. The gentleman understands immediately, and remembering both his prosperous diamond businesses and his stable contract with the imperial family, he tries to determine what the prince really seeks, finally stating that there is no agreement yet. Kalyan smiles upon hearing that and asks him if he is capable of leading something more than a simple commercial union. Paluna affirms that with people and money, everything is possible. The prince knows he has both resources, so he wants him at the head, not before warning that the Vrisen will also be involved. Although Palun is more concerned if Kalyan himself will be included, to which he laughing sarcastically confirms that he is also included. With this, Palun feels safer, even with the presence of the Vrisen, and the prince then reveals that he possesses the resources and the necessary people to form a commission of mages. However, administrative problems still remain to be solved, so he asks Palun to take care of it. The debt will be settled, Kalia nascent, and both reach an agreement, with this matter resolved, and having managed to avoid his death before his birthday. Now surrounded by people he can trust, all that remains is to hear Cephanian's testimony at the Rosalita. And so the day of his birthday arrives, entering the hall, being received by all the nobles. He walks down with a big smile until he meets Place, whom he greets cheerfully, only to ignore him and walk past. Place, however, calls him Blood Eyes. This bothers the protagonist, who insists that he call him by his name, but Play makes it clear he cannot do it because he is not Kalyan. Kalyan stands paralyzed, listening to how the second prince expresses his doubts about how he learned to ride a horse or master the sword, and why he has developed such a violent attitude. Finally, Play confronts him directly with a question that resonates in his mind. Who are you really? And at first he hesitated, remembering how everything had already changed, and he had stopped being Berun, the king of Secritia, who was overthrown by the Mad King, Place, and who was before him, since he was also not the Mad King who overthrew him. So trying to calm down, he ignored his brother's strange claims, which only managed to annoy him even more. Later, Aelin was surprised that Place knew, accepting that the boy was smarter than they had thought. Kalyan belittled him, doubting that he was truly aware of anything. However, Aelin did not allow him to become complacent, because if Place had discovered him, the person who had called himself Prince Kalyan had not yet managed to convince himself completely. The protagonist was speechless, accepting it, realizing that even though he denied it, he still couldn't completely leave Berun behind. Looking up at the sky, he feels frustration. His teacher noticed his state and threw him an object so that if they needed to reflect, they could do it together. It was a communication ring, which would allow them to always stay in contact. And when he was outside the castle, because the powers of a dying dragon caused poor reception, however, its operation was limited only to the outside, and Callan thanked him for further improving their master-student connection. And student, however, his worry does not cease, so Ellen tells him to calm down, since the prince now has many allies. He understands this, giving him a big smile, and thus some time passes, and finally the Sigrid Knights, led by their commander Jurin, presented themselves before the prince, who welcomed him to their territory, where Cephanian's nest was located. Introducing themselves as his escorts, Kalyan feigns happiness, sensing a not-so-cordial energy from the knights who welcomed him. However, he perfectly understands why they watch him, with murderous looks. His chief's grandson, Jan, was his servant, and right at that moment, Jan arrived very cheerfully to inform him that he had to move on to the next step. Kalyan, noticing the hostility in the knight's eyes, asked him to bring him something to drink, which further irritated them, and after a brief discussion about what kind of drink he should bring him, the servant withdrew. Meanwhile, Elon and the half-elf siblings watched the awkward scene, which concluded with Kalyan turning to look at the knights with an expression of joy, as if mocking them. Elon, uncomfortable with this, could only ask what the purpose was of continuing to provoke them further. And finally, everything seemed ready to learn the will of the dragoness Sephanian. The people celebrated the arrival of the young protagonist's entourage, while Play observed the scene with an attentive gaze. And at home, his mother drank tea with an expression of disappointment, and Kalyan rode, exchanging glances with his teacher, until he dismounted his horse, to thus arrive at a huge pair of doors which opened before him, marking the start of the prince's coming-of-age ceremonies. And now we return to the castle, where Ramin argued with Elon about his decision to allow Kalyan to go alone, although the mage assures that he runs more risk than his son, which the king interpreted as his son having too permissive a teacher. This amused Elon, who was surprised to see the change, and the careless king, who paid no attention to his children, turned into a strict father, trying to calm him, reminding him that up to this moment, Kalyan had not said anything untrue, which worried Ramin even more. On the other hand, Kalyan rode with Jan, realizing that his teacher was in the castle, since he wasn't receiving a signal from his ring, and Jan informs him that according to what he heard, it seems the castle was engulfed in huge chaos due to the arrival of the priests of Tessel, and although the prince hopes to resolve that later, since he was also responsible for the tense atmosphere with the guards who clearly still hated him, despite Jan having done everything possible to avoid it, and by everything possible, he meant talking to the Sigrid knights, and returning to that moment, when a commanding voice told them that their prince had been declared without magical talent, and with a sword recognition, which clearly caused more anger in the soldiers, who listened as Jan spoke in a somewhat strange manner, like a fragile precious flower, with which they had to be extremely delicate. This only enraged all the knights, because their lord, heir to Sigrid, had to take care of a delicate blooming flower. Kalyan, feeling those hateful stares, wonders how much more he could endure, considering they still had 3 hours of travel left. Jean suggested resting, but Kalyan stopped for another reason, becoming alert. Arsene and Kiri likewise, and the confused protagonist waits attentively, as it didn't seem like they were under attack, although something worried him. It was then that a little elf came running from the forest asking for help. She introduced herself as Ja, and asked for something to eat, under the gaze of all the warriors prepared for anything. Kalyan took her by the hands and asked what she was doing there. The little girl seemed to be hiding, and he apologized to them. Kalyan heard this, recognizing that the little one clearly wasn't telling the whole truth. Pondering what to do, Arsene asked the prince what he would do, and he suggested that they first give her food. And at that moment, he became alert again, noticing that someone was following the little elf. He immediately covered her and ordered his men to hide her. Just as a subject arrived on horseback, Irene already stepped forward and asked the hooded man's intentions. He affirmed that he was only chasing a small thief, although the knights denied having seen anything like that. The man still dismounted, deciding to investigate among them, which annoyed the commander. Kalyan instead asked him for the thief's description, offering to investigate, and the little elf was terrified, and the hooded man accepted, but when he passed by the prince, he calmly told him not to look back, since the people accompanying him did not plan to protect him, because they were only waiting to confirm that the child was there to unleash a rain of arrows. And the hooded man, contrary to common sense, did exactly what Kalyan warned him not to do and turned around quickly, thus provoking a huge rain of arrows in his direction, which were shattered one after another, courtesy of the protagonist, who saved the hooded man and reminded him that he had warned him not to look back. And the arrows kept falling, with the soldiers trying to protect the prince, but Arsene stepped forward covering with his shield, and when the arrows stopped falling, Yaren sent his men to chase the responsible parties. Meanwhile, Kalyan realizes that the attack has ceased, assuming they have escaped, not noticing the sadistic look of the hooded man, and Arsene assures him that he will take care of protecting the elf. Kiri, for her part, worries about her boss when she notices an attack heading directly towards him. He tried to warn him, however. Kalyan blocked him easily, activating his aura in his hand. and hitting his attacker with a brutal thrust to the shoulder, leaving him seriously wounded. The Sigrid soldiers are surprised to witness his strength, although Jean arrives very worried and insists that he must trust his knights to defend him, as he is a weak person. This leaves the soldiers confused, who clearly see that the prince is far from being a delicate flower, especially after how he left his enemy. Later, Kylo tries to talk to the prince to get information about what happened, but he fails to understand a single word the child says, so he turns to Arsene to translate for him, as the boy seems to answer even before being asked. Arsene, confident that it will be a simple task, realizes that after a long while, without understanding anything, and that apart from that the child seems to have taken a liking to him, he also manages to decipher that the elf lives in the Siriska forest, and that his name is Yarius Tianyuria. He also seems to have a companion named Luca, who was the one who stole from the bandits they encountered. And during the escape they separated, and the little elf ran straight towards them, still not knowing why. And he seems to answer before they even ask him. Although Sirius claims not to believe him before Callian even mentions the prophetic gifts. Setting aside the stress the little one causes him, he asks Arsene to accompany him. Callian understands his request and decides to escort him to the vicinity of the forest to prevent him from being captured, since in any case, their destination leads them in the same direction. Jan asks him if they will investigate more about the matter, but Callian has no intention of getting involved, and he orders the chief of the nearest post to take charge of the problem. Right at that moment, Yaren arrives to show the prince what he found among the prisoners' belongings. Callian cannot believe what he sees, recognizing the object very well, remembering the exact moment he poured it into his tea before dying. It was that strange medicine that stops the heart. With this, he immediately decides to order talking to the prisoner, and the interrogation of the prisoner began, the latter belittling the boy, because he believed Callian was just a simple member of a wealthy family. But soon, he understood that he was someone more important. However, Callian only revealed to him that he was the heir to a prestigious family. Despite this, what really interested him about the prisoner was knowing what that small cube they had stolen was. He claims not to have any idea. He simply took it because it seemed like something valuable. Callian then asked him what the bandits were looking for, but the man affirmed that he didn't know. He couldn't see who they were either because of the masks they wore, and he had no further information. Callian understood that the prisoner was protecting them, although he doubted he was doing it out of honor or loyalty. So he directly asked him the reason for his silence and promised to help him if he cooperated, asking him to trust him this time, given that as a member of a renowned family, he can offer him his help. The prisoner, after hesitating for a moment, was convinced and mentioned his wife, who lived in the village of Hansen, and that she was in danger. Callian promised to protect her at all costs, which led the prisoner to give in, and so he told him about the object the bandits had lost, a strange and small orb, which they didn't know exactly what it was, but they had to deliver it to a Tenzil priest. Callian supposed it was a divine object, since Tenzil priests usually collected these types of artifacts to replenish divine power, thus understanding that the object must be of great value, which explained the uproar it had caused. However, it had no relation to the medicine he had found, since this medicine was actually something carried by Secritia spies in case they failed in missions. That's why he obtained it from White Eagle. And luckily for him, the prisoner also provided new information. Everyone in the group called their leader a peculiar name, with the alias Blue Queen. Upon hearing that name, a huge memory struck Callian, who immediately became nervous, unable to believe that little bird was there. Later now, the place was being battered by a typhoon, and the group moved to a residence in the Ratran territory, where they sheltered from the intense rains. There Callian was sitting at the table, annoyed, as he had to tolerate the presence of an annulment man, and drunk Count Hail Ratran, lord of that territory, who very cheerfully and energetically mentioned that their encounter had been a great stroke of fate, which only further agitated Callian, who contained his anger at the noisy noble. Remembering how in the forest, Jan mentioned that Count Hale was one of the nobles who sent gifts last time. However, Cullian barely remembered him. What he did know was that in the past, this count had supported Prince Randall, but after a war, he changed his allegiance to place, and now it seemed he was trying to do the same with him. And in the present, the count was still an admirer, who insisted on being so excited to meet him that he had lost sleep. But the young heir was not fooled. assuming he said the same thing to everyone, and seeing how the worried faces of the butlers surrounding the count betrayed that the subject was a headache, especially that of Malcolm Chetties, who was Hala's personal butler. And at that moment, Arsene interrupted the room with news. He had managed to trace a message addressed to the Blue Queen, who apparently specialized in those types of climates, and Hala, upon seeing the mage, only thought of adding him to the party, offering him a good drink. However, Callian had other priorities, hoping the Count would stop drinking alcohol, and give them the location of Tenzil's sanctuary. Upon hearing the mention of the sanctuary, Hala dropped the wine bottle, spilling it on the table, and he tried to maintain his festive attitude, but reflecting on Callian's question, his expression changed from a cheerful drunk to an angry drunk, expressing his hatred towards the Tenzil priests, whom he considered arrogant and dark-hearted, and clearly wanted to eliminate them. His anger was such that he ended up shattering the glass he held in his hand. Then, with a single word, he fell onto the table, deeply asleep, courtesy of a spell from Callian, who with a smile admitted feeling offended by the Count's attitude. Later during the night, Callian rode with Yaren while psychically conversing with Elon, to whom he summarized the situation, since once again they had gotten into trouble, this time with a stolen sacred artifact, and a Secritian spy risking his life. However, Callian seemed cheerful, satisfied to at least still be alive. Elon, for his part, decided not to worry too much, but Callian assured him that if the Blue Queen was who he thought she was, there was no real danger, since she was just a spy covering her alibi. In his original timeline, he had known them as the people who never failed a mission. That's why he needed his teacher's help to locate Tenzil's sanctuary in the region. With this information, he hoped to discover the Blue Queen's true objective. Arriving at a mysterious and dark bar, where a woman was cleaning glasses, suddenly a figure passed through the door. It was Callian, who greeted with a big smile, and asked her not to worry about the people outside. However, the bartender clarified that she was not a soulless person, to attack those who had no relation to her mission. Which surprised the protagonist. He approached the bar, still pondering whether the ambush before was intentional, and the Blue Queen told him that she knew who he was, which is why she had ordered her men not to be reckless. It was then that the dim lighting allowed Callian to realize that he was in a bar full of corpses. That was the consequence of disobeying the charming boss, and Callian approached and asked her if he was also a nuisance to her. She admitted that yes, about to grab a knife from under the bar, but stopped when she perceived the protagonist's terrifying aura. Reconsidering her decision, understanding that it would not be convenient to treat him as an enemy, thus forming a kind of truce, the protagonist asked her what had happened to the elf she was chasing. Apparently, he had disappeared, which led the Blue Queen to regret having followed him, since it had only brought her more problems like the boy she had at her bar. And so, in the middle of that uncomfortable encounter, the woman approached the protagonist to suggest that since neither of them had suffered serious harm, it would be best to leave everything alone, and she promised that the little elf would not be harmed. Kalia did not seem happy with the deal. Seeking answers, took the Blue Queen's glass cup and asked what the purpose of searching for divine artifacts was, since unless she was a priestess, she could not use them. This comment seemed to irritate her, as she snatched the glass from him and affirmed that it was because they were worth money. She sarcastically views her as a merchant. She uncomfortably admitted it, since her line of work didn't pay well, and at that moment Callian supposed her client must live in that small town. Otherwise, she would be trafficking in a better-paid place, like the capital. She served the wine, while commenting that she preferred to work for someone who paid her a fair price, something difficult to obtain these days. He understood that they had been working together for a long time, and he understood that a Secritian spy could only be harmed by one thing: information. And seeing how she was using those jobs to gather information about Kairos, he slowly put the pieces together until he realized that the Blue Queen was exchanging divine artifacts in exchange for information about the state of Kairos, just as the woman finished pouring the wine, offering him a smile. Incredulous, he finally discovers who the client was. Meanwhile, in the Kairos castle, Elon arrived to ask an annoyed Ramin a question, who was complaining about his royal advisor, who wanted to gossip late at night. And he reminded him that he knew well that he didn't like to sleep, besides preferring to get answers instead of being left with doubt. And so he asked him directly how many Tenzil priests were in Kairos jurisdiction. The king, rubbing his eyes in frustration, supposed he was asking for a reason, but preferred not to know what it was, grudgingly answering that there were 14 priests in Kairos, all living in the castle except one, and they had recently requested that they stop recruiting more priests, leading others to believe that the rest had only been used and then discarded. Aelin interpreted this as a strategy to prevent them from having priests to turn to in times of crisis, and he asked His Majesty how he had responded to that situation. Ramin simply let them do whatever they wanted, as the crown did not interfere in religious matters. So with everything said, he asked for the reason for the question. The mage naturally explained to him that his son needed the information. The answer left the king confused, since Kallian should be aware of all that, assuming that was the reason why he had gone to the Tran. Meanwhile, Kallian watched as Queen Zulu started drinking from her wine glass, and suddenly he understood Hala was her client. She did not confirm it to him, but warned him that he was asking the wrong questions, smiling maliciously. And so the protagonist rode at full speed while conversing with his teacher, exchanging information. And he finally understood that Hala had always had a Tenzil priest under his roof. That was the reason why he sold Kairos secrets in exchange for magical artifacts. In this way, determined, he tried to return to the castle as soon as possible. Elon asked him why, but Kallian replied that he made the drunk count fall asleep after having drunk too much, so that he would stop bothering him, but now he understood that everything had been an act. Meanwhile, a heavy rain lashed the castle. Malcolm insisted to Jan about knowing Kallian's whereabouts, as his master wished to apologize for what happened at dinner. However, Jan insisted that the prince was just out for a walk, doubting that bothering him was a good way to apologize, and very seriously reminded him that a count's butler should not ask about a prince's affairs. This seemed to make Malcolm back down, although his insistence continued. When asking what time he would return, Jan started to feel uncomfortable. He doubted how much longer his boss would take, and how much longer he had to keep covering the prince's absence. And facing the annoying presence of Malcolm, who didn't seem willing to leave, the door opened, and Kallian appeared, annoyed because they wouldn't let him sleep, directing his look of annoyance at Jan, blaming him for not having invented a better excuse so they would leave him alone. Jan apologized for the butler's insistence and affirmed that he would take care of solving it. With this, Kallian shot an annoyed look at the butler, before slamming the door shut, leaving him worried, and from inside the protagonist completely soaked. He heard Malcolm insistently apologizing for the interruption before withdrawing, which relieved him. However, he couldn't help noticing that his attire and attitude seemed like an excellent imitation of Play's, which ended up disgusting him somewhat. For his part, Jan entered the room frowning, clearly displeased, not only with the way his boss had returned, but also with the chaos he created by entering through the window. However, an unconcerned Kallian only wanted to know if he had received any other suspicious visitors, and Jan replied that only the annoying butler and a suspicious prince who used windows to enter and leave, remembering when he tried to stop him from jumping from the third floor. Kallian laughed, recalling it, but also noticed that his butler was very angry, the first time he had seen him like that. Doubtful of why, he explained that it was all due to Malcolm's insistence, who kept asking when the prince would return. This confused Kallian, as it seemed his interest lay more in the time of his return than in his whereabouts. Noticing this, he decided to inform his teacher. In this way, both concluded that Hala had never really been drunk, but had used that trick to try to escape the castle unnoticed, and close the deal with the Blue Queen. However, by making him fall asleep with magic, his plans were ruined, further complicating his situation, since now they didn't know for sure what information he had obtained. Elrond understood all this, although he doubted why Hala clung so much to the relics. Kallian did have the answer. It was his way of avoiding walking a tightrope, knowing that someone as manipulative as him needed to maintain good relations with Randall, while at the same time siding with Place and sending a gift to Kallian, and seeing that everything began with Cyrus's appearance, leading to the capture of a man who revealed the Blue Queen's name and the existence of the sacred object, which would be the gift for Randall, all these facts being too many coincidences. Watching the rain continue ceaselessly, feeling stranded in that place, Kallian supposed he would have to capture some bats before leaving. Meanwhile, Callie was furious because Kallian had used magic to knock him unconscious, completely destroying his plan, hating him, considering him a mere low-blood commoner, starting to pace desperately around the room, his anger turning to Silica, complaining why he couldn't eliminate him as he should have, remembering that his central alliance with the crown was maintained through the Frozen Sea. In a fit of rage, he began to destroy everything around him, while the servants trembled in fear hearing his shouts. And he shouted desperately that they had promised him a beautiful piece of land near Kairos. But everything had been delayed because of the protagonist, and at that moment, Malcolm entered, fearful and trembling, trying to speak to the arrogant count, who sat down to ask him if he managed to recover his contact. And the butler told him that he couldn't contact him, and doubted he could do so that day. The answer caused Hala to throw a cup directly at his head, threatening him. And seeing how now, due to the rain, Colin would clearly sleep there, having to change his plans, for which his pained butler asked him if they should delay the schedule. He, shouting like a madman, told him yes, seeking to close the deal once the prince left. Hala, still shouting like a madman, aggressively ordered his maid to bring him clothes, determined to finish off the one he called a low-class bastard. And the night continued with Callian calmly drinking his wine, while Hallie watched him with annoyance, thinking in his mind that he couldn't stand him continuing to act as if nothing had happened, especially after making him fall asleep with magic, irritated by the prince's attitude, who seemed to value his status as a count less, since he knew that if the other nobles discovered that Callian had used magic on him, it would cause the prince to be underestimated, like a novice without class, and lose support. With this, he planned to humiliate him as soon as he had the chance, starting his plan by apologizing for his attitude the previous day. Callan, with total calm, accepted the apologies. Hala, confused by his answer, asked him directly if he had used magic on him. The prince confirmed it without a second of hesitation, suggesting that he did it in time to prevent his host from looking like a complete idiot. Hala, in shock, realized that he had basically forgiven him, as if he had been the guilty one. Callian, for his part, understood how difficult it must be to face royalty, so he gave him a broad and understanding smile, with Hallie hesitating without knowing what to say after his answers, imagining how he wanted to strangle him, seeing that he basically blamed him for everything, leaving him speechless. Just then the prince changed the subject and talked about the case of the man who attacked him the previous night, mentioning that he had said something strange during the interrogation. Hale, while drinking his wine, thought it would be interesting to know what he had discovered. However, when Callian mentioned a birdman, Hale choked on the wine and ended up spitting it everywhere. Malcolm immediately ran to help him, but Hale angrily rejected him. Callian assured him that he would continue investigating, but believed that the count should know, and Hale nervously pretended to offer his help, although internally he only thought about how to prevent him from continuing to investigate his territory, and in a way to quickly get rid of him. And at that moment, Iharan arrived with new information for the prince, extending an invitation to the count to accompany them, thus going directly down to an extremely dirty prison, which caused Hale to look disgusted. Callian, for his part, perfectly knew the count's thoughts and had prepared a trap in that place, hoping to catch him like a bat. And so they arrive with the prisoner, who was agitated by the visit, asking if his wife was well. That visitor was Callian, who assured him that she was, just as he had promised. However, he did not bring good news. He warned him that he would soon be declared guilty of attacking the royal family and would be executed. Furthermore, if he did not treat his wounds immediately, a severe infection would take him before his sentence arrived. It was then that the prisoner confessed everything. He not only mentioned the little blue queen, but also an agent of Secritia who was in the city to sell a sacred object. He also hinted that she had maintained a long relationship with his client. All this was heard by Hala and Malcolm, whose nerves increased with every word. The confused prisoner asked why it would be a problem for a spy to have such a close relationship with his client. But Callian was clear that was considered high treason. Hala, paralyzed, listened as his opinion was requested. Nervously, he tried to pretend he agreed with Callian, but the prince hoped he would make a mistake and end up confessing so he could negotiate with him. However, he did not expect that upon returning to his room, he would receive a visit from the snitch Malcolm, who, completely desperate, begged him to spare his life and confessed that he was only following Hala's orders. Callahan observed him with surprise, as he never intended for this to happen, but the result served him anyway. Taking the opportunity, he asked the butler if he was really a Tenzil priest, since he supposed that only a priest could have the necessary confidence to handle the purchase of divine artifacts. However, he also noticed that it seems Hala has found something to have even more control over Malcolm, and the terrified butler begged him not to reveal that he had been selling divine artifacts, since if Tenzel's order found out, they would execute him immediately. Kalyan, surprised, realized he had made a mistake, seeing that it was not a plan of the Tenzel order. And without wasting time, he asked who they had really sold those objects to. The trembling priest finally revealed the truth. They had sold them to Silica's younger brother, Viscount Brisson of Renown, who was apparently stealing sacred objects from Tenzi, aligning himself with Randall and betraying Blaze, as well as the entire Brisson family, including his sister, who was moving all the pieces to make Blaze the heir to the throne, and seeing how what began as a plot to catch a simple bat ended up capturing something much bigger than a lion. However, upon informing Elon of this, he suggested that they first discuss it with Ramin. Nevertheless, Kalyan decided to act on his own and asked his teacher to send a letter addressed to Hala. And later, meeting with his team, he gives instructions that someone treats his prisoner. And since a long time has passed with that wound, his arm must be amputated, sending medicine with Iharan for after the amputation. For her part, she sends Kiri to look for the subject's wife and take her to a safe nearby place. And at that moment, Cyrus rushed in, followed by Hina, quickly answering any questions they might ask to prevent the girl from being punished. Kalyan pretending he had no intention of asking anything, and surprised by how adorable the elf was, observed how he approached to look at a small bird, and Jan curiously asked if his master would keep it, but Kalyan intended to return it to its owner. Meanwhile, the little elf was entertaining himself by inviting Gina to play with him. Kalyan and Jan noticed that the girl really liked the bird, so the prince promised to gift her one when they returned to the castle. However, blushing, she had to refuse the gift, thinking that her roommate wouldn't like it. Kalyan accepted her decision and asked her that when she went to eat, to open the cage door and the window, thus hoping to attract an important guest. And during the night, the prince waited calmly in his seat while reading a book. Suddenly, a hooded figure entered through the window, and it was exactly who he was expecting and who he had sent the letter to. Struck by such grand poetry, where he threatened to send a report of his operations to his base, revealing herself as Blue Queen, who doubted why the threats. Kalyan demanded proof that Hala had been trafficking divine artifacts in exchange for keeping his secrets. However, the young woman remained completely silent for a time, which he interpreted as confirmation. She corroborated it, admitting she didn't like complications, and in a quick move, she threw magic needles directly at him, leaving him surprised, since the Blue Queen he knew used to use swords, not hidden weapons, and in this way he barely managed to block them with his magic shield, where the needles crashed, and caused an explosion that destroyed part of the room, and his men arrived quickly. But Callan ordered them not to enter, and surprised that the girl was trying to kill him. He asked her what her next trick was. She replied that she had no more tricks, and without hesitation, she lunged at him with her sword. Kalyan blocked her lunge, but noticed that the material of his own weapon would not withstand her aura, and he decided to end the fight quickly without using his power. He deflects the girl's sword to attack her. She manages to block it, however he takes advantage, and with a quick movement manages to disarm her. Then the Blue Queen activated a new trap, a small golden sphere that she threw at Kalyan. He couldn't dodge it, but filling his sword with aura, he managed to split it in two before it reached him, but destroying his sword in the process. The Blue Queen was astonished to see that Kalyan also mastered the art of the sword. For his part, he seemed completely defenseless against her, and with few alternatives, he called her by her real name, Ayla, which confused her long enough for him to approach. He put his hand around her neck and took the opportunity to examine the inside of her mouth. But he did not find the poisoned tooth that Secritia spies were obliged to carry. With this revelation, Kalyan demanded that she give him all the information. Ayla hesitated, wondering if by doing so, he would let her go. And her manner of speaking aroused Kalyan's fury, because it was completely different from that of a noble Secritia spy, and very different from the Blue Queen he had known. And now, instead of acting with the determination of a loyal spy, she was trying to negotiate her freedom, suggesting that if he let her go without causing further scandal, he would not reveal his aura master powers, since she assumed there was a reason why he hid them. This comment only managed to infuriate him more, especially when he remembered La Isla, who had known a spy loyal to her nation, devoted to the sword and a great friend. None of that matched the person in front of him. Tired, he took her by the neck and affirmed that he should never have asked her to spare his life. However, his fury diminished until he finally let her go and suggested that the secrets he was asking for would not lead to her execution. But if she told him what he wanted to know, he would prevent her from being interrogated, especially by White Eagle. Meanwhile, Hala was desperate, waiting for Malcolm, furious about the letter he had just received from Elon, in which he stated that the Queen was already aware of the deals they had been making, and suggested that he look for a good defender. Hala assumes that Elon knew everything from the start, and that he was being blackmailed, and he refused to crawl like a lapdog before the Prince of Low Blood. Instead, he decided to activate his escape plan, heading to his secret vault, where he kept all the divine artifacts he planned to sell. Convinced that with them he could get rich, and anywhere else, now that business with the Vrissons had become complicated. Unfortunately, he didn't realize that behind him, an invisible trail was slowly materializing. Suddenly, the artifacts disappeared from his hands, courtesy of Arsene, who assured the Count that he would tell the Snake Mage as well as the commoner Prince that he had been very cooperative in the investigation. So Arsene handed the divine artifacts to Kalyan, and along with them, all the secrets Hala had been selling all this time. The relieved protagonist believed that everything was over with this. However, at that moment, Jan called worriedly to alert him about something happening outside. Kalyan approached the window, and to his surprise, saw hundreds of golden knights entering. These were the king's guard knights. Confused, he tried to understand why they were there. And back in Kairos, Aelin was furious because the king had sent his personal guard when it had been agreed that he would send the royal knights, which the king apparently planned by taking advantage of the moment he went to deliver the letter. However, Ramain had his decision clear. He simply didn't want to risk sending just anyone related to the Friesen, trusting only in his loyal swords. The mage accused him that such favoritism could cost Kalyan his life, which was the reason why the king had been uninterested in all his children for so long. Nonetheless, remembering how frustrated he had been because of it, he decided to completely change his perspective. And so afterwards, he was ready to have breakfast with the princes who still remained in the castle, with the intention of observing how they got along. Upon hearing this, Elon stopped his complaints and smiled, pleased with the king's change in attitude, hoping they would have a good time. Meanwhile, in Latran, Malcolm begged Kalyan not to leave, but he had already left his soldiers in charge of cleaning up the chaos and transferring the prisoners to the capital where they would be judged. The only exception was his prisoner Norton, who had been presumed dead and helped escape the castle. At that time, they supposed he should already be on his way to meet his wife. Despite that, the butler remained restless, doubting his fate. Kalyan, with a serious expression, assured him that the money he owed Hala did not matter to him, but being involved in illegal purchasing of items was a serious matter. Malcolm admitted his mistake, so Kalyan, remembering that he had helped a castle prisoner, decided to give him a chance, hoping he would prove his loyalty in the future, leaving him as administrator of Lathran. Malcolm, excited by the forgiveness, turned pale upon hearing the position assigned to him, and Kalyan, for his part, said goodbye with a big smile. And so the journey towards Cephanian's nest resumed, where they received several pieces of news. Among them, it was reported that Hal had been relieved of his post, and he would spend the rest of his life in prison, while Ayla had been executed. And remembering how the news narrated that in the public square, Renacita leaves were scattered all over the ground, a strange type of cactus that perfectly absorbed moisture, and was mainly used to prevent blood from staining the ground after an execution. And then in the castle, Randall was eating comfortably, when Place interrupted him to clarify the rumors that his mother had ordered the execution of the criminal who had attacked Incommode. Due to the misunderstanding, Randall paid barely any attention to him, surprised that his brother had stopped drinking. This only amused him, not thinking he missed seeing him drunk. However, his attitude only caused Randall to stand up annoyed, demanding that everything remain peaceful for the moment. And in his anger, he threw a gold fork onto the floor, which irritated Place, who made it clear that he has no interest in changing anything. Returning with Kalyan on his journey, he encountered a new problem, a landslide, which would delay his journey even more. Seeing the setbacks in Latran and the bad condition of the road, he began to think he would never reach his destination. And just then, Sirius appeared, taking him by the arm, very cheerfully offering that they go together to the elf village. Then, Sirius wonders where his friend Luca and the elders he was supposed to help were. So he proposed that the next morning they would head to the elf village. Callian, seeing the boy's tenderness, accepted the idea, although he joked with him, implying that he seemed to be directing the mission. And then he hugged him as if he were a small, cute creature, ending up making him uncomfortable. And the next day they arrived at the village, amazed by its beauty. Even Callian admitted he didn't expect to be lucky enough to see a place like that. At that moment, an old elf appeared, who demanded to speak with the king of humans. And although Callian considered himself a representative, it wasn't like he brought the king. And the elf introduced himself as being the elder of the Hiddix village, who explained that they needed a favor from the king of humans. Callian insisted that he was not the king, but he was surprised by the speed with which he requested the favor. However, the elder didn't even care about being rude, and told him that 3 of his elves had gone to the nearest human village, and never returned, just like 2 others who were sent to look for them, given that Cerno knew a lot about the human world. And not wanting to risk more elves, he directly requested that they take charge of finding them. This surprised Callian due to his direct and somewhat rude attitude, considering he was very different from the elves, and half-elves he knew, and he asked him why he wanted him to take charge of the search, to which Sir insisted that he did it because he was the king of humans. This made Callian uncomfortable, who clarified that he was not, but a prince, and that humans were not a unified race, but only ruled within their jurisdiction. Sir didn't seem to care in the slightest, which led Callian to become serious and make it clear that they were talking about very different things. His words managed to reduce the elf's arrogance, who accepting corrected himself, calling him prince, and offered him in exchange for his help a secret path that led to the land of Sigrid, which far surpassed the roads built by humans and would reduce his travel time by less than half. Callian calculated that this would help solve the delays, so his attitude changed completely, and he accepted the mission with enthusiasm. This seemed to please Zur, and now with his new mission, Durin explained the situation of the area to him. If they wanted to investigate elf trafficking, they would have to go to one of the 2 villages, Nerika or Stin. Ciri had apparently already been in those areas and had encountered a large number of mercenaries, although not of a criminal nature. With this information, Callian ruled out the possibility of slave trafficking and decided to investigate the nearest town, which appeared to be Stin. However, according to Urin, they had to be careful, as both villages maintained a great rivalry, probably because their rulers were the same age, but Callian downplayed the warning, and he was excited about the idea of looking for a new sword. As soon as he arrived at the town, he went directly to a blacksmith, but there he found that they clearly didn't want to sell him a weapon, since they claimed he was too young, which annoyed him, so he insisted on buying one. However, the blacksmith explained to him that at that moment, all his weapons were reserved for the castle mercenaries, so if he was looking for a sword, he should go there. Callan then supposed he would look in the neighboring town, but the blacksmith warned him that he would get the same answer. It was then that he understood the real problem he had got himself into. They were between 2 cities preparing for war. Understanding why he had been sent there, he had to protect the elf village located in the middle of the conflict, returning then with 2 letters to write, which had to be sent to the leaders of both cities, hoping that with that, they would manage to delay their plans and allow the return of the missing elves. Furthermore, he warned them that he expected them to fulfill their part of the deal, as they would leave the next day. Zur, terrified, tried to stop him by mentioning the war unintentionally. Callian admitted that he had tried not to suspect, trusting the elves, but in the end, Zur ended up betraying that he tried to trick them. Then he told Zur that he had discovered that their 5 missing elves were actually listed as mercenaries in Sting, earning money while waiting for the start of the war, and a war that the elder clearly knew about and was trying to stop by using Callian. However, he refused to be manipulated, breaking the agreement and prepared to leave. Zur, desperate, tried to stop him by asking if he would really allow a war to break out. In his territory, Callian stopped dead in his tracks, reflecting for a moment, but concluded that there were always people fighting for some reason, warning the elder that if that place was important to him, he should protect it himself, instead of trying to manipulate him. That said, he withdrew, leaving Sur in the dark. Later, Ciri informs Callian about the whole situation, directly blaming the Breeson Merchant Union. and he realizes that once again they will have to deal with problems caused by Renan, since he discovered that both Nerika and Sting were villages with soil that did not allow the cultivation of wheat, which was supplied by the Friesen, who for no reason had stopped selling wheat to one of the villages, which led its inhabitants to try to obtain it from their neighbor, who in turn asked for exorbitant prices. And although he did not like the situation, since not only the high command suffered the consequences, but the townspeople could starve, doubting what he should do, and later Sir apologized to him, admitting that he knew his political influence, that he needed it to attract back his son, Luca, who seemed to be part of the mercenary elves, admitting that he didn't mention it before because he feared that Callian would refuse to help in that case, begging him for forgiveness for the deception, and pleaded with him again to intervene to prevent the war. Callian, firm in his decision, replied that he would only deliver the letters to the lords of the towns. Sir worried, but Callian assured him that once he did that, he would ask what else they needed, apart from wheat, to think about how he could help them. The elf was surprised to hear that he was willing to help, although the prince made it clear that he was not doing it for him. Still, Sir gave him his sincerest gratitude and promised to honor his word. However, the protagonist continued thinking about the situation late into the night, and time and again, the name Renan Bryson came to his mind, as he seemed to be a constant annoyance. Finally making a decision, calling his teacher, beginning what seemed to be the cleanup of the trash. Meanwhile, in the Bryson mansion, the Marquis and the patriarch of the family were prepared to leave. But to his butler's astonishment, they canceled their plans because they were expecting an important visitor, which left his assistant wondering who it was, and at the same time Elon approached in his carriage. Once the meeting began, both started with pleasantries. However, Elon knew he was there for something more specific, and he didn't take long to inform him that his second son was providing too much help to the king's firstborn. And although Evan doubted that his son was reckless enough to do such a thing, Elon noticed that he had a rather carefree view of him. However, he hadn't come just with words, but with proof, showing them documents. After reading them, the Marquis became enraged and asked what Aelorn's intentions were in showing up there. He limited himself to communicating that it was he who had to take charge of Renan. However, Evan was not willing to allow such a decision to be made by a simple party mage, who entertained Aelorn, as he did not consider those words worthy of a bloodthirsty swordsman. This response only fueled Evan's fury, who smashed the table with a blow, feeling disrespected in his own home. And he remembered then that swordsmen were illustrated in the art of the sword, with the intention of spilling blood. Elon understood that Evan did not consider him an adversary, so he began to release his energy, ready to see his reaction, generating an aura so intense and terrifying that it provoked the best weapon that mages possessed: fear. And Evan, although enraged, was forced to think twice. Luckily, Elon seemed to want to have a calm chat, although he warned that he was not as gentle as his disciple. Evan became nervous at the mage's confident smile. However, Elon was also worried, because although he knew his own abilities, he couldn't be confident against a sword master. So he simply told him to take care of his son, suggesting an unremarkable mechanism, and he proposed the same thing his disciple had suggested. If Renan was expelled from Bryson, Callian would buy his merchant union, and the prince's plan was supported by the chaos unleashed by rumors that Silica had been poisoned, hitting the merchant union hard. And although the Bryson had always been a family of knights, the merchant union had only been created to compensate Renan, who was not skilled with the sword. Therefore, Evan would probably not be affected by getting rid of it. However, Elon knew exactly what Evan would answer, because he wanted something that would benefit the third prince. But Kaelin had already foreseen this reaction and had a second plan ready. And if Evan rejected the proposal, he would sell the merchant union to his ally and owner of the second largest merchant union in the kingdom, Palun, who seemed willing to buy it for a reasonable price. Meanwhile, Renan was tenderly caring for his plants, although in his mind, the chaos caused by Hala's capture kept turning over. This had forced him to sell many of his belongings in case he had to escape to Tenzil. His fury grew to such an extent that he accidentally broke a leaf of his plants, which caused him to lament immediately. And just when he was trying to stop worrying, a shadow appeared behind him. A knight grabbed him by the neck and forcibly took him away, destroying his plants in the process. Then time passed. Rumors about Renan's collaboration with the trafficking of stolen objects in Tenzil began to circulate, finally ending up in a secret prison, shouting for them to release him in the name of his family. And thus, Renan disappeared. Evan suspected Elon and Palun, but there was no connection between them, so the deal for the merchant union continued without problems. Elon informed Kalyan of this, who was now preparing to continue his journey, arranging everything with the villages, and with Zur, who entrusted his guide to Luca. However, Kalyan refused and preferred that his friend Cyrus guide them, who seemed capable of doing so without problems. And with all this resolved, he only noticed one small detail: Cyrus had spoken normally. At that moment, Kalyan took a small stone from the elf, observing it closely, and asking Luca if he had also taken that when he stole the divine object. The nervous elf said he didn't remember, although Arsene considered it possible that this was even the true divine relic, theoretically being a small stone with an inscription that Luca found upon returning to the village. The protagonist thought he might be right. However, there was something about the object that made him feel in danger. And Jurin came running, stating that the object gave off a strong smell of blood. Kalyan had also noticed it, a scene that perhaps a mage like Ars wouldn't perceive. Unlike a swordsman who lived the war like him, he immediately recognized it as the intense smell of a life forcibly taken away, concluding that the stone's owner had surely been murdered and that they should investigate it. But for the moment, to be able to communicate on the road, they decided to leave it with Cyrus, who considered that he should ask Luca for permission. However, the protagonist had already claimed ownership of the stone, without the elf being able to say anything. Cyrus very happily assured them that he would return it to them when they finished leaving the forest. Meanwhile, he would play with it. Kalia watched him having fun when Yaren appeared behind him, recognizing the little elf's powers to vaguely see the future. And the protagonist agreed, although he couldn't help but feel confused, since it seemed strange to him how a space-time alteration, like the ability to see the future, could be nullified by a simple stone. And that made him think that perhaps the object was related to the axis of time. And meanwhile in Kairos, in the rose field, which were increasingly withered, Randall received news from his butler. Upon hearing it, his gaze fell upon a small rose, completely dead, and he sighed, remembering his brother's phrase, "The roses will bloom soon." Noticing how the one who had fallen was now Renan, and he took a small necklace with a tiny pendant from his sleeve, and he activated it, returning life to the rose, hoping to contemplate it. A little longer, and back in the forest under the night sky, Kalyan seemed to be gathering a large amount of energy in his chest with absolute concentration. In this way, he channeled all his power until he fully released it, receiving congratulations from his teacher for having managed to further improve his aura. Although the real goal was to practice magic, Kalyan noticed the sarcasm in his teacher's words, and he would have preferred a more direct scolding. But Elon was not too hard on him, since he knew that Kalyan had been a swordsman, so he was used to transforming mana into aura instead of using it for magic. Kalyan was aware of this and was annoyed with himself, as he seemed to be doing it out of mere inertia. And Elon, for his part, understood that the problem was not lack of knowledge, but habit. So he warned him that he must solve it before returning to Kybus. The protagonist hesitated about achieving it, but Elon trusted him, reminding him that he walked a path no one else could travel, and that all paths eventually lead somewhere. Just like that, the next morning, Cyrus informed them that their journey through the forest path was coming to an end, and Kalyan walked under the first rays of the sun, and upon looking up, he was surprised by the landscape that stretched before him. For the first time, he contemplated the land of elephants, an enormous kingdom built among the mountains. With this, a happy Cyrus told them it was time to say goodbye. However, Kalyan, looking at him, asked if he really wanted to return to the village, remembering how happy he got when they offered to be his guide. Furthermore, he noticed in the short time he was there that they were sidelining him, probably because of his ability to answer before being asked. And for that reason, he proposed accompanying him, hoping to be able to help him by asking Cephanian's will about his history. Cyrus clenched his fists tightly and admitted that the villagers bothered him. However, with great energy, he extended the stone towards the protagonist again, affirming that the tree mother had told him it was okay to be like that he shouldn't change anything, because strange as it seemed, he was still an elf. Smiling innocently, he assured that being different wasn't bad. Kalyan was amazed by that response, smiling as he realized he still had many things to learn. In this way, he received the magic stone from the elf, promising him that he would see him again, which greatly pleased Esiaris, who thanked him for having saved him. And so the farewell became emotional, with everyone happy, laughing to see that the one who ended up being most fond of him was Arsene, who gave him a big hug. And so Kalyan and his group approached the enormous fortress of the Duchy of Sigrid. Contemplating it, he felt Sifanian's will to protect the land reflected in that imposing and solid stone wall. With this, he recognized that all the other princes must have felt the same way when entering there. And that feeling surely was one of gratitude that Sigrid had never considered taking the throne. And then he turned to look at Jan and informed him that during their stay there, he would cease to be his butler, since he was tired of the hateful looks from 20 people, considering that he couldn't handle an entire city. Jan tried to refuse, but the prince insisted, until annoyed, Jan assured him that he would take care of it. However, Jan's expression and words awakened a memory in Kalyan of when he himself had spoken those words in the past. Specifically, when he promised that everything would be fine after his haircut, to end up stopping a knife with his hand. And later, when he promised to take care of his problems with the Brison, only to end up consuming poison, and dying and reviving. These memories made him nervous, as he observed the confidence with which Yana said it. And later, after taking a bath, he complained that he still hadn't reached his destination since they had only passed the outer wall. And it was still about 2 days to reach the castle, seeing that this fortress looks like a huge city. And he considered it unlikely that they would manage to reach Slay at those hours, and finally decided to stop complaining. Although that tension was captured by the magic stone, remembering the little elf's words, and which he understood, he considered that just like little Cyrus, who didn't stop being an elf just for being different, this was applicable to his case, since if he couldn't shake off the habit of converting mana into, although both shared the same base, the only option he had was to create a magic circle with aura, and that was precisely what he did, unleashing his power in the room, and the released energy was so strong that it was even felt outside, reaching Arsene, who was astonished, wondering how what should be a warm aura and gentle transformed into cold magical energy, and he began to wonder how far his boss's power could go. Meanwhile, in his room, Kalyan celebrated finally managing to create his 4th magic circle, getting one problem off his back. However, there was still more to solve. And the next day, Jan announced his arrival at the palace, where another problem soon arose. And just like Kalyan, there were 5 other sword masters on the continent, and they were capable of perceiving the aura of masters inferior to them. And just thinking about this at the moment Slay's arrival was announced, who came out with great enthusiasm, happy to see the prince again. However, Kalyan's fears seemed to come true since the Duke of Sigrid, second sword master, would undoubtedly notice his aura, or perhaps not. Slay only noticed his new height, amazed at how good he looked now. And although Kalyan felt a little uncomfortable at first, after a moment he decided to play along, affirming that he was indeed much better than before. Slay burst out laughing, happy to have him there, and led him into the castle, leaving behind Jan, who watched the scene with happiness. And while riding together, Slay praised Aelin's good eye in choosing such a talented disciple, and he also mentioned how impressive it was to see the 6th sword of the continent learning magic. Kalyan realized that he had been discovered from the beginning, although he expected no less from someone with so much experience. Slay assured him with complete naturalness that even if the prince couldn't see it, he was currently enveloped in aura, and he congratulated his teacher for managing to get Kalyan to that level in such a short time, although Kalyan knew well that he was giving his poor teacher premature gray hairs. And so night fell, and Slade had to take his leave to attend a temple inspection, apologizing to the prince, who understood the situation. And thus the Duke left, asking him to take care and expressing his wish to hear his stories in the future. For his part, in Kyrie's romance, he served a large glass of alcohol, which surprised Elon, who didn't expect the king to invite him, supposing that he was either celebrating that Kalyan had arrived safely and saved the land of elephants, or was worried about him. And the king, after finishing his drink quickly, confessed that he was worried about the moment the camelin's light would turn on. The surprised mage understood what he was referring to, realizing that the king still didn't know whom to choose as the crown prince. The king explained that when Kalyan returned, the 3 princes would be of age, which meant the time to choose an heir was approaching. In this way, he analyzed his options. Randall was the most educated and serious, but at the same time uninterested. place the strongest, but also the most volatile. And Callion, who had not yet fully matured, Aelin gave him a great idea and a sure solution. Choose the prince he disliked the most, so that the other two would eliminate him in their fight for the throne, thus solving the problem by elimination. The king, too tired to respond to such nonsense, simply ignored him. Elon was only joking, but he made it clear that perhaps Randall wouldn't even be interested in the throne unless Callion wasn't an option. And more seriously, he advised him that no matter what his decision was, he must keep it secret so that Callion and the other princes remain safe. And he was calm, because in the end, Elon firmly believed that the chosen one would prove his worth. Meanwhile, Callion, dressed formally, walked nervously towards a cave, where he went deeper and deeper, without finding a clear path to his destination, not understanding how much further he had to walk, until a huge flash of light enveloped him and transported him to an immense field of flowers. He looked at the landscape, observing in all directions, until something that intimidated him appeared before his eyes. An almost infinite magical power, capable of paralyzing his heart with fear. Clenching his fists, he understood he was not facing the will, he was facing the splendor. With no other options, he bowed in reverence to Sephanian, who materialized before him. And from the proximity to an agricultural village in the mountains, he was alerted by a roar. Its inhabitants turned their gaze and were astonished to see a colossal pillar of light enveloping the entire mountain. The phenomenon was caused by Sephanian, who was before Callion, who remained intimidated by the presence of the beautiful half-dragon, who had appeared in her complete physical form. She, with a simple movement of her hand, transformed everything into clear beauty, freeing Callion from that fear, and promising him to stand firm. And Sephanian's long hair streamed in the air, as she asked why a child who shouldn't even be alive in this world was looking for her, whose memories belonged to another era and whom she feared, hesitating to shield her blessings as if they were a sword. So she approached him to get close enough to look him directly in the eyes in a threatening manner. While in the city of Arsel, Jan and the others observed the enormous flash of light, knowing that it had appeared just when the prince entered, which worried them, especially Jan, who watched anxiously until he was surprised by his father, who was amused by his expression of anguish, scaring him even more, causing Jan to complain to him, since he wasn't supposed to be there. He clarified that he had already been to the temple, which made no sense, as it seemed too fast. And everything was explained by the sudden appearance of a little girl with silver hair, who introduced herself as Veronica Manisel, Elon's granddaughter, an adorable little girl accompanied by Rachel Grace, Elon's daughter-in-law. And so back with Callion, Sephanian decided to see his memories for herself, and brought her hand directly to his face. And as soon as she touched him, she unleashed Baron's memories, contemplating hundreds of images of war, the axis of time, the death of many of his comrades, and his own demise, until waking up in Callion's body. Then she understood everything and withdrew her hand to the surprise of the protagonist, who saw the woman move her lips. But he couldn't hear anything. Sephanian understood him perfectly. She didn't want him to hear her. Callion, still bewildered, asked her if when she referred to her, she was talking about Serenity. The woman confirmed it, then remembered that in another time, to stop the War of the Gods, 8 powerful warriors helped to close the seals of the evil god, including Serenity, who ended up trapped in an eternal sleep. If that was the case, the protagonist didn't understand how she could intervene today. But this seemed arrogant to Sephanian, since she herself was there through her will. Therefore, Callion was asking the wrong questions, and the prince understood and decided to rephrase his question, this time wanting to know why Sephanian desired the axis of time of Secritia. She did not hesitate to answer, but again her voice was muted, which frustrated the protagonist. Finally, the woman told him he had to be patient, since she feared that in his eagerness to discover how he died in the past, he would end up ruining his future. And Callion understood that his destiny had been intervened in some way by divine forces. And he realized that the axis of time was perhaps more important than he imagined. At that moment, he remembered the cry of pain from his brother and asked the last question. Had Chase been his own brother who had used the axis of time to bring him back to life? Sisyphanian, incredulous at the question, reminded him that his brother before being his brother was a king, and she expected Callion to be aware that no king would make such an illogical decision, so she doubted very much that Chase had been that stupid. Callion understood, but now he was much more confused. If it wasn't Chase, than who had turned the axis of time. And Callion remained with his head bowed, confused until Sephanian approached and asked him to show what he had. At first, he didn't understand what she meant, but after analyzing it, he remembered the magic stone. He took it out of his pocket and handed it to her. She took it with surprise, trying to tell him what it was, but once again, her voice was muted, which seemed to start to annoy her. So with no other option, she simply returned it to him and asked him to take care of it, assuring him that revelations would soon arrive. She also asked him not to feel bad for not getting answers at that moment, as she began to fade away, leaving him alone in the cave, with her voice echoing in the distance, expressing that he should return when he was ready. Meanwhile, in the town, hundreds of people released carrier pigeons into the air, all with the same message. When the third prince entered Sephanian's nest, a brilliant light spread. The movement of carrier pigeons surprised even the Duke of Sigrid, who did not expect so many gossips in his territory. Just then, a little girl appeared, with a serious expression, who didn't seem very happy with her father's attitude in admiring the spectacle. And it was Demira Sigrid, who complained about his casualness, although Slay preferred to keep watching the pigeons fly without giving it too much importance. However, his daughter feared that sooner or later those messages would reach the ears of people envious of power, which could bring them great trouble, and she then proposed looking for those who sent the messages and watching the spy countries. Slay, instead of showing concern, burst out laughing and congratulated himself for having chosen such an intelligent wife, since thanks to her, his children had inherited such agile minds, given that he admitted that it hadn't even occurred to him what his daughter mentioned. However, he clarified that if he took a defensive stance, it would be interpreted as a political move. And he reminded her that their position was that of guardians, not seekers of power, and that their strength only existed to strengthen the nation's shield. Demiria understood, but as she looked at the prince's window, a feeling invaded her. This time she would have to act. Slay understood his daughter's concern and proposed looking for possible spies without making a fuss, trusting that his brother was with the prince, or maybe not, since Jan was also there, very excited by the spectacle of the pigeons in the sky. In fact, he joined his father to admire it, which only increased Demiria's anger. For his part, Kalyan observed through the window, remembering Sephanian's words, "Return when you are ready." And he didn't know what to expect when that happened. At that moment, Jan entered the room and was surprised to see him staring out the same window for so long. He supposed he had seen something interesting, although in reality Kalyan was just daydreaming, until finally, something in the gardens caught his interest. Jan approached to discover what it was. Kiri and Gina playing with Jan's dog, the adorable pet of the Sigrids. However, the human Jan didn't seem to appreciate it, probably because his father had given him the same name. Kalyan, for his part, noticed that they actually had a certain resemblance, which angered his butler even more. And despite this, the prince hoped that his palace would allow him to have a dog, as Hina seemed to have taken a great liking to it, watching how both were adorable. And at that moment, Jan reminded him that he should look for a dog that understood sign language to communicate better with the girl. Before this, Kalyan asked him how he learned sign language. Jan replied that he had a brother who passed away due to an illness. Kalyan regretted asking that question, but Jan seemed to have overcome it, especially because he now had Kalyan, and both exchanged a smile before talking about the dog again, as Jan doubted that his siblings would agree to have a dog as a pet in the palace. So Kalyan joked, telling him that the only option was to move to Camelin. Jan reminded him that only the crown prince resided in Camelin. Without batting an eye, Kalyan considered it his only alternative to have a dog. Jan sighed, regretting that his motivation to be heir was simply to get a pet. However, just then Kalyan dropped a bomb. He had met Sephanian in person. Jan froze completely before shouting in amazement, and while Silica was having her hair done and tidied up, awaiting the response to a letter. Just then the message arrived, filling her with excitement. And so some time passed, and Kalyan finally managed to contact his teacher, who was very worried about him. His disciple apologized for not having done so sooner, but he was looking for a place in the entire Sigrid castle that was not protected by Sephanian. Aelin was surprised, since he thought no such place existed, but Kalyan found one. Although he didn't seem happy with the location. This was the Sigdith Cemetery, an uncomfortable place to talk among graves, remembering how Jan took him there, considering it the most remote, deserted place, and out of reach of Sifanian's power, presenting the gloomy landscape. And although he clearly didn't want to be there, Elon put aside his complaints and asked him if he had concluded the mission with the Rosalite well. Callian replied yes, but to be more specific, the story was long. And so in Karis, Elon listened attentively to the narration about how his disciple knew the real Sifanian, regretting not having accompanied him. However, Callian explained that he asked him to return and promise to take him next time, which left his teacher eagerly waiting. And at that moment, they began to talk about Renan, wondering if Silica hadn't acted strangely after his disappearance. Elon told him that after 10 days since Renan's disappearance, Silica became alert, to the point that Marquis Evan had to intervene. Callian feared he would end up revealing the truth, but Elon seemed calm, as they had signed a hard oath. And this seemed exaggerated to Callian, until his teacher reminded him that he did exactly the same thing to Silica, leaving him wanting to complain, but without the right to claim anything. And although with this, he could stop worrying about Renan. Although he had another problem, since now Silica had been taken away from the one in charge of moving his plans outside the castle, and how to get the poison they tried to eliminate him with, he thinks they will surely get a replacement. In addition to this, Elon had a big problem, a letter that had been keeping the king awake. Callian supposed it was from Mangraver Bryson and seemed to be correct, since Silica apparently contacted him after achieving nothing with Renan. The protagonist worried about the imminent arrival of Grey Bryson, the eldest son of Marquis Bryson, and ruler of Mangrave. In Man, he had a territorial dispute with Tenzil. Furthermore, he was one of the great sword masters, and according to the letter Aelin read, Grai requested a replacement to govern in his territory, as he had been wounded in a battle against the barbarians, and he sought refuge in Kairos to recover. However, this seemed a clear excuse to return to the capital, something Aelin had tried to delay for a while. And Kaelan thanked him, although he was interested in what would happen if they ended up confronting each other. And later, he met another sword master, Slay, who was using a giant log as an ecological seat. Kaelan, encouraged, sat down and told him in a serious tone that he had met Sifanian, although Slay thought he was referring to her will. Callian clarified that he had met her in person, and although he knew that perhaps he wouldn't believe him, but the Duke reacted oppositely. He was thrilled to learn that Sifanian was still alive, happy that his 500 years guarding an empty nest had not been in vain. The protagonist was glad to see him so happy, and told him that it was likely he would see her again. Then he asked permission to create a magic circle that would transport between Sigrid and Karis. And although the Duke had no issues, he doubted if Ramin would approve, as this would put the capital at risk. However, Callan assured him that it would not be so, since he would build it in his territory within Kairos, keeping it away from Sigrid, and maintaining it in a secret location only for trusted people. Furthermore, he assured that if it ever represented a threat, he could destroy it. He agreed under the condition that Ramin approved it, and that the circle was at least 1 day's distance from the castle. Callan, relieved, thanked him, although he still had one last favor to ask. This excited the giant, who thought Callian would ask for training. However, Callian told him yes. But no, then with a movement of his hand, he materialized pure energy in the form of a crystal, leaving Slay astonished to see Callian manipulating pure aura energy. Callian explained that his intention was to test it as a sword, forming an energy weapon in front of Slay. He recognized his intentions and excitedly drew his own sword, and preparing for combat while filling it with aura. In this way, both were ready to face each other. And after the first sword clashes, Callian realized something logical, while Slade advanced directly towards him, unleashing all his power, understanding how powerful he was, and he saw him full of confidence, wielding a heavy but sharp sword, while smiling during the training. And despite Callian maintaining all his concentration, with a simple move, he was sent flying. Although he managed to stay on his feet, and the one truly surprised was Slade, who had noticed that Callian's move was about to reach him, realizing that the young man's sword compensated for his lack of strength with speed. And Callian returned to the attack immediately, launching all the blows he could, astonishing Slay even more. He perceived the boy's great skill, who was trying to overcome his difficulties and become stronger, even when using a sword that consumed a large amount of aura and magical power at the same time. And he sees how despite all the difficulties he managed to maintain his pace, unable to avoid being impressed by that child who had come so far. However, he still didn't consider him his rival, and tired of holding back. He warned him that if he wanted to improve, he had to get serious. That seemed to excite Callion, who would do the same. And Slay then threw a blow with all his might, one that Callion barely managed to block. However, right after, with a quick move, he managed to pierce the Duke's defense. And he launched a direct attack on the neck, lightly cutting it much to Slade's surprise. This annoyed him, so he released his aura, cauterized the wound immediately, and lunged into the attack. Callion, terrified, tried to backpedal, realizing that no matter what he did, he could never deflect that blow, and he prepared to receive it, observing the imposing Slade, trying to block it. However, the impact was so devastating that both swords shattered, and at the same time he managed to lightly cut his cheek. And both were astonished by what happened, including the prince's wound and the shattered swords. At that moment, Sigrid's knights arrived alarmed and terrified to see the wound on the Duke's neck. Noticing it quickly, they declared him defeated, which ended up agitating him, and after all the chaos, a celebration arrived, which Slay enlivened with a beautiful violin melody, earning the prince's congratulations, who praised his multiple talents. Slay showed gratitude, but remembering his wound, he offered to demonstrate another of his talents later. This made Callion nervous, who replied hoping his injury wouldn't interfere with his concert. However, for the Duke, the only thing truly hurt was his heart, as he remembered how much more worried Jan was about Callion than about him. Feeling that little by little he was losing his son, and despite this, Callion thanked him, because he had learned a lot about his ability and his own limits. And now he knew he needed to increase his power more to better sustain his technique. However, Slay observed him closely the entire time, until he reminded him of the wound he had given him on the cheek. Callion, not giving it importance, told him not to worry about that. But the Duke insisted that during the fight he had been distracted, analyzing his fighting style, realizing that he was still applying too much force to the lower part of his body. It would take its toll. Callion, surprised, replied that he had never noticed that habit. Slay understood him, as he explained that it was a deeply ingrained habit among Secritian swordsmen. Hearing this, Callion froze, while the Duke insisted that if he had learned to use the sword of Karis, he wouldn't have that habit, and he clarified that in Karis, swordsmanship focused on the legs to maintain balance, something reflected in his short horizontal line. And although Callion feels trapped by this observation, in the end Slay only gave him one piece of advice: to take care of his style, as most wouldn't notice it, except MacGraver Gray. Even so, the young man doubted that he would ask questions, and so the party continued. Even the most serious knights ended up dancing, and that's how Sigrid was, a place where elephants weren't interested in what the shell of a prince might hide. With a huge and confident smile, Slay asked him for a second round, something Callion appreciated, and the young man asked him if Gray could see his aura. Slay told him that, when Gray decided to follow the path of the sword, his father Evan was not at all happy about it, and as punishment sent him to an uncomfortable position of power in Mangrave. However, despite this, Slay was clear that Gray was much more powerful than his father, and that he could surely see the prince's aura, warning that Callion should prepare well, something the young man, with great determination, already had in mind. And so 10 days passed, and Callion is in the cemetery, receiving his master's complaints, and who thinks that he apparently liked Sigrid too much, since he still had no plans to return, even though his student apologized for having extended his training, mentioning that he only lacked a few details. However, he was more interested in knowing if Gray had arrived. His master confirmed that not yet, but he warned that no matter how much they delayed his arrival, they could only do so for 15 more days until the next full moon. Kalia then noticed that he had to prepare many things before that date. Walking back to Sigrid Castle, Ivan Gusciato knew that as a mage and sword master, once he met with Gray and Evan Breeson, they could discover his aura, which would increase surveillance on him. For this reason, he would turn to Arsene, looking for a way to hide his mana. Fortunately, Arsene knew some techniques that, considering Callion's level of magic, he could learn without problems. And Callion knew that since both magic and aura come from mana, this could be useful. And the mage offered to teach him, and the prod accepted. But first, they had to deal with another matter. Remembering that Elon's council had initiated the construction of a movement magic circle with Rachel's help. And Veronica, especially Rachel, whom his master recognized as a very capable mage and expert in movement magic. with experience transporting the Duke of Sigrid, and Callian proposed his plan to improve the connection of the Kingdom of Karis. And both mages accepted, with Ars showing particular excitement, as it would help both the mages with their circle research, as well as Callian to hide his mana. However, although the young man learned the technique easily, the real challenge was keeping the spell active, and the only way to confirm if it worked was with Slay's help. But he observed that Callian's new technique still yielded no results. Thus, Callian combined his work on the magic circle with his training, but continued to fail, which left everyone exhausted. However, some time later, he finally succeeded, and Slay was ultimately unable to perceive even a trace of his aura. So he congratulated him, pointing out that now he looked like a mere prince. With this, Callian decided that everything was ready. In this way, Slay said goodbye to Callian and his group, warning him that next time he wouldn't be so lenient with the boy. Callian did not plan to be left behind, with everything ready, embarking on his journey towards Karis. Meanwhile, in a castle, a muscular man, surrounded by beautiful women, read a letter brought by his proxy. Who would replace him? However, the imposing man scorned him, provoking the annoyance of the small emissary. He tried to respond, only to be interrupted by the booming and lunatic laughter of the muscular giant, who stood up and looked down at him with superiority, believing that the capital had become interesting. Then Grey Breezen affirmed that it was time to leave for Karis. While in the castle, Elon was surprised when passing into a room full of gold. Apparently, Callian obtained those riches thanks to the territory he owned, a small but prosperous wheat producer, managed by Paulun, who sent him a huge monthly payment. Observing all the earnings, Elon proceeded to organize them and deposit them in the safe of his excessively wealthy student. And then he left the room, where a maid was already waiting for him to close the door, thanking him for the gesture, and then leaving, walking through the hallways, and at that moment he ran into Place, to whom he offered a nervous smile while greeting him. However, the prince wasted no time and asked him directly if Callian had changed after meeting him, or if he had already met him in that state, making it clear that this doubt had persisted in his mind since the last time they spoke. So he thought about consulting his teacher, and with a huge smile to Elon, he returned a question with another saying literally, "Did you start thinking too much from drinking alcohol, or did you start drinking? Why were you thinking too much?" Exchanging smiles, few sincere ones before Place broke the silence, realizing that he wasn't the only one with doubts. And Elon clarified that everyone changes. Some stop drinking, others stop feeling intimidated. But in the end, everyone changes. That was his only answer before leaving Place unconvinced. And so time passed. Exactly 20 days since Callum left Sigrid, and now he was next to Kiri on a balcony, enjoying the tranquility of the peaceful Reddington Lake. And he really has no intention of visiting that place, were it not for an accident that Veronica's horse apparently suffered. Courtesy of Rachel's movement magic, and according to Callian at least, they were well received by the Count of Reddington, who, just like the lake, appeared serious and thoughtful. Taking advantage of the calm, Jan served him tea and suggested he enjoy the moment, as both knew that once they reached the castle, they wouldn't allow themselves such relaxations. Just as Callian began to enjoy the rest, they were interrupted by the sound of a Vryson carriage arriving at the mansion. Noticing the scene, Callian reacted immediately and quickly sent Jan to ask something. And the butler went to Count Tersey Reddington to consult him if he wished to introduce his upcoming guests to the prince. Tersey, visibly nervous, seemed aware of the conflict between Callian and the Vrysons, who had just arrived, and based on the Count's courtesy, he was willing to send away his new guests. However, he already asked for a moment, since if that carriage was Grey Breeson, Callan was willing to offer him tea. And effectively, Grey Breeson was the one who arrived accompanied by two women. Seeing him, Tersey and Reddington felt great relief, as they would not have found themselves in a fight. Already grateful to the prince for this, he arranged the meeting, which Callan arrived at with great enthusiasm, being announced with great fanfare before the Count. The Count, a little nervous, informed him that Grey Bryson happily accepted the meeting, although the expression on his face said the complete opposite. And so they both ended up exchanging glances. Out of fear for the Count, he tried to get Grey to stand up to greet politely, but Grey had no intention of doing so, and mockingly blamed his supposed injuries. Such an attitude did not please Callian at all, who only accepted that kind of lack of etiquette when it came from his friend. Slay, So faced with Gray's mocking attitude, Callian became serious and demanded a bow from him. All this was heard by a terrified Jan. Still believing that Callian was weak, he thought he might get hurt, despairing, thinking about calling for reinforcements. And suddenly Arsene and Rachel appeared, whom he was happy to see, as he would need them soon. However, Arsene complained about the lack of respect for privacy, seeing how he was basically spying on the prince. At that moment, everyone was interrupted by the arrival of Hina, who arrived crying and breathless, running towards Jan to try to communicate. She informed them that apparently there had been a confrontation between her brother and the Berun knights, which alarmed Arsene, who quickly decided to help. Jan reminded him that he shouldn't attack first, and Arsene understood and left as quickly as possible, while Jan, terrified, watched more problems brewing. For his part, inside the enclosure, Gray was reacting annoyed and surprised to what Callian said. Asking him to repeat it, he had no intention of doing so, and very seriously, only asked him to obey. The giant begins to rise, furious at the way he is speaking to Callian, who has no intention of backing down, forcing him to bow. At that moment, Callian remembered having asked Jan if he had recognized Gray before. According to Jan, yes, but it had been so long that even Callian himself didn't remember it. Supposing that he did not expect that attitude from the prince, and that his only source of information was silica. Gray, for his part, was not prepared to face this internal battle, being trapped between yielding and being humiliated before the prince or drawing his sword. In any case, he knew he was cornered. Gray was surprised to realize that Silica's recent exaggerations were not due to age. At that moment, he confirmed that everything they had said about the third prince was true. He was no longer a mere pawn. It was then that Count Terzid raised his voice, extremely nervous but firm, demanding that Gray show respect. His whole body trembled, but his action earned him Callian's respect, who considered that he had made a good decision by trying to avoid the conflict. However, for Gray Brycene, the Count was just an annoying obstacle he wished to eliminate. And even so, at that moment, his fury was mainly directed at the prince. With no other option, with contained fury and a forced smile, Gray ended up bowing. And Callian, seeing him determined, postponed the matter and proposed leaving, which further enraged Gray. Before leaving, he asked him to take good care of the Count. As he looked pale, Gray seemed increasingly furious, on the verge of exploding. While the prince maintained his smile, however, it disappeared along with everyone's emotions when, suddenly, a huge explosion lit up the sky. Callian immediately recognized this magic as Arsene's magic, and he knew that an ice mage would use fire magic, unless it was a signal. While nearby, the knights are terrified, watching the fire with confusion, while Arsene realizes that he still doesn't understand the whole story. And addressing Sakiri, he warned her that the prince would not be happy at all, while standing in front of the remains of the Drizzen carriage. And the Drizzen soldiers are furious, but with some fear, trying to claim. And in response, Arsene made it clear that they had attacked one of the third prince's followers, calling them simple dogs of the Marquis' heir. And although one of the soldiers tried to answer, Callan arrived, reaffirming what his mage had said, surprising everyone, and he quickly assessed the situation and asked if he should pay for the carriage. Jarson agreed to have it deducted from his salary, and Callan decided to accept the proposal, feeling relieved to see that his entire team was present and that apparently nothing serious had happened. However, he wondered why Hina wasn't there, as she usually followed her brother to the stables. And looking at the soldiers, he waited for an explanation. The terrified soldier remained silent, while Arsene explained that the Berun men, not knowing that Hina was Callian's maid, had tried to take away their master. At first, Callian didn't seem upset and even let out a laugh, but his expression immediately changed. His gaze turned murderous, and with fury, he turned to the shameless soldier, and with one move sent him flying in liters of blood, leaving all the soldiers speechless. And just then Gray arrived, observing with an expression of rage how all his soldiers had lost their tongues. However, Arsene clarified to him that those were no longer his soldiers, but simple men who had assaulted the prince's attendants and struck one of his warriors, and as a consequence they were stripped of their titles and tongues. Gray, with no alternative, burned with fury upon seeing how his soldiers had embarrassed him in front of the attendants and Tersith's soldiers, and meanwhile, Callian calmly walked past him, stating that the carriage expenses would be covered by Manazil when they reached Kairos. Grace, with no option, could only watch furiously as Callian walked away, and on his way, Kalyan passed Kiri and asked him for an explanation. However, Kiri remembered his past, how he had been beaten and mistreated for trying to protect his sister, discriminated against because of his condition, remembering every time she cried seeing him hurt. With these thoughts in mind, he decided to say nothing. Apparently, Kalyan understood him and simply continued on his way. Later, much calmer, Kalyan enjoyed with a smile an exquisite tea, courtesy of Count Terzid. The latter asked him with some concern if he was really okay after what happened, especially because Gray had left furious, and he feared he would try to take revenge on the prince before they reached Kairos. Kalyan remembered that when he met Gray Bryson, he could feel the aura emanating from him, and this meant that they were on the same level, or that he was even inferior to him, and calm about this, he stated carelessly that sooner or later, he would have to face him. Terzid, amazed to see Kalyan's calmness, admired his confidence. However, he still had the last question. And from the balcony, he looked at Kiri, who was completely sweaty, running around the mansion for hours. It seemed evident that Kalyan had imposed this discipline on him, or a necessary measure to teach him a lesson, even if he had to be rough with him, believing that he was exaggerating. However, Kalyan assured him that he would not trust his back to someone who could not endure such a situation. The Count understands, since he considers that it is not a punishment for the fight, since Arsene destroyed the carriage, was resting comfortably in his bed while Kiri was running. Rather, he sees it as a punishment for having trusted him at that moment, recognizing that Kalyan's servants are very close to him, which causes him some envy. Kalyan interrupts him to remind him that Gray demanded the Count's carriage to replace his own. However, he refused to give it to him, claiming it was broken, although Kalyan doubts that's true. And Terzin notices that the prince discovers his lie, and that from the beginning, he tried to prevent the Dryzens from reaching his land, regardless of the consequences that this could bring him, and seeing that Kalyan knows everything, he has no choice but to be honest, and admit that he pretended the carriage was damaged so he wouldn't have to give it away. This elicits a smile from the prince, who asks him if he doesn't miss his family in Karis. And although at first the Count doesn't understand what he means, Kalyan pulls out of nowhere a letter with the seal that guarantees him a meeting with him whenever he wishes. Then he asks him to accompany him to Karis, and Terzid, surprised and somewhat nervous, takes the letter and assures him that when the prince is ready to leave, his carriage will also be ready. On the other hand, on the Vryson lands, Place informs his mother that Kalyan will return soon. Silica, however, remains calm, drinking tea and assuring that it is only a rumor. Surprised that after 5 months of not seeing each other, the only topic of conversation with her son is still Kalyan, and Play understands that it is not exactly a warm family reunion. Even more so when his mother mentions that Mangravi Gray will arrive soon, something that matters little to him. And his indifference ends up annoying Silica, who demands that he stop being so rebellious, since anyway, that will be the path he must follow. This only irritates him more, since he is against the paths imposed by others, and his annoyance awakens a sinister smile on his mother, who tells him to stop behaving like a child. Because destiny will not change, Silica tries to tell him about her plan, but Place interrupts her before she can finish, making it clear that he is not interested. She looks at him with disgust, realizing that while some have changed, others remain exactly the same. A response that only brought forth a condescending one, demanding that he stop trying in vain. Amidst laughter, Place admits that he has overexerted himself, so following his mother's advice, he decides to remain silent. Meanwhile, Kalyan rode with his group towards the kingdom and tells his teacher that Count Terzid will arrive in a week. Aelin is happy about the news, as it will save Paulun from dying of work stress. This amuses Kalyan, who notices they've had problems in the palace, and his master replies ironically, pointing out that it's hard to avoid them when the prince himself is a walking problem. And Kalyan, interested, asks what his father said about his delay and the problems caused. Elon clarified that Raymond has decided to bring forward the creation of Valken, which leaves the prince in shock. And Elon recalls that night when Ramen, under a bright sky, looked at the horizon with anguish. He knew that news about Sigrid would attract too much interest in Kalyan, which would intensify with Mangraver's arrival in the city. And with no other option, he decided that the best thing was to bring forward the creation of Valken and establish them in the old house of the Knights of Pavel. And a worried Aelin warned him that this would amount to a declaration of war against the Vryzen. but the fully aware king preferred to run the risk rather than expose his son to danger. Upon hearing the story, Kaelan's concern increases, as he knows that such a war, neither Valken nor the Order of Knights protecting the king could do anything against Grey, clearly fearing how his father might end up eliminated. With this thought, he asks Jan if there is another alternative path, but it seems there isn't. Faced with this, Kallian decides to execute his own plan and warns Elon that he is about to cause another incident, since he will not allow Grey to reach Kairos. Meanwhile, Grey is in a small, completely uncomfortable women's carriage, and with his manhood damaged, furiously hitting the walls to hurry them up, when a rider warns him that someone is following him. This forces him to get out and look. Then he runs into Kallian, who watches him.